Papyrus and passion. The reality behind ancient Egyptian intimacy were not in modern Cairo with its taxis and honking chaos. You are much farther back. The Nile has just finished its annual flood, the waters retreating like a slow sigh, leaving behind black silt so rich that wheat and barley will grow with barely a prayer. The temples still smell faintly of incense. The workers have just completed another wall of hieroglyphs in the name of the gods. And in a modest mudbrick house not far from the riverbank, a young woman is combing her hair with a fishbone pick. She is preparing for her husband to return from the granary. This is not a scene of erotic excess or divine seduction, this is daily life. And here, in the midst of this quiet, we begin the story of sex in ancient Egypt. To understand Egyptian sexuality, you must first let go of modern assumptions. The ancient Egyptians were not bound by our categories of taboo, shame, or even privacy in the way we might assume. Sex was not merely an act or an indulgence, it was a force of balance, fertility, order, and the great cosmic mythos. It was sex that regenerated the world. But that doesn't mean everyone was walking around in orgiastic ecstasy or engaging in mystical rites daily. In fact, most of the time, sex was mundane, scheduled, strategic. Married life, family expansion, and lineage were always part of the picture. The average Egyptian woman married between 12 and 14, the man perhaps a few years older. There were no legal wedding contracts early on, only mutual agreement, and cohabitation marked the beginning of a union. It wasn't until later periods that formal documents would emerge, usually focused on property division in case of divorce. And while Egyptian art may be full of idealized depictions of gods in human form, engaging in romantic and sexual scenes, real-world depictions of sexual acts are surprisingly rare. The daily laborers and scribes who lived in the shadow of temples had different priorities. Sex wasn't a painting, it was part of morning rituals, night routines, and the quiet intention of creating children. And yet, this doesn't mean the Egyptians weren't expressive or conscious of sexual appeal. Consider cosmetics, which were used by all genders not for vanity, but for protection from the sun and insects, and, incidentally, to enhance beauty. Heavy coal eyeliner wasn't merely aesthetic, it had antibacterial properties. But of course, it also made eyes appear larger and more dramatic. Perfumes were carefully crafted from myrrh, cinnamon, and blue lotus, a plant with mild psychoactive properties that the elite would steep into wine. Sexuality, then, came through scent, softness of skin, the length of one's linen robe, and the way it clung to a dampened body in the heat of the day. The people of ancient Egypt were not prudish about the body. Nakedness was common in laboring classes, especially in the oppressive heat. Children ran unclothed until puberty. Nudity was not necessarily sexualized, it was contextual. But once adulthood was reached, clothing began to reflect status and allure. Sheer linen was popular in the New Kingdom era, and artists often depicted women in form-fitting, almost transparent garments. It's hard to know whether this was artistic exaggeration or fashion reality, but even so, the implication is clear. The body was not always hidden away. We also see sexual metaphor deeply embedded in religious myths. Take, for instance, the story of Isis and Osiris. When Osiris is dismembered by his brother Set, Isis searches for and reassembles his body, but cannot find his phallus. In some versions of the tale, she fashions a replacement from gold and impregnates herself with Horus. This isn't pornography, it's cosmology. The regeneration of the cosmos is rooted in union, even through loss. In this, sexuality becomes divine not because it is salacious, but because it is essential, of course. Not all depictions of sex were divine. There is one particularly infamous papyrus, discovered in Deir el-Medina and now often referred to simply as the Turin Erotic Papyrus. It is explicit, shockingly so by the standards of most ancient art. The scroll shows scenes of exaggerated sexual positions, often involving priests or animal-headed men. Scholars still debate whether it was satire, pornography, or ritual instruction, but it is the outlier. Most Egyptian records avoid graphic depictions. They do, however, allude. Love poems from the New Kingdom, written in flowing hieratic script, onostraka and papyri, speak of longing and metaphor, the taste of beer on a lover's lips, the ache of an upset embrace, the weight of a desire that makes the speaker unable to eat or sleep. One poem goes, "My brother torments me with his eyes. My heart is caught like a fish on his line." Here, the word brother was not familial, but romantic and affectionate term of endearment. Much like beloved today, these were not the words of a priest or noble, but the verses of a young woman or man in love, longing. And though we rarely know the names behind these words, their emotion survives more vividly than the monuments of kings. Sex in ancient Egypt was deeply tied to fertility, not just for the family but for the land. The Nile's flooding was seen as the result of divine union. Crops grew from the earth because the gods had embraced, and temples. Fertility rituals may have involved symbolic sexual acts, but contrary to popular myth, there is little reliable evidence that these were performed, literally or publicly. The priests did not engage in orgies, nor did the temples double as brothels. Instead, symbol statues, offerings, sacred oils were employed to invoke divine favor. The act itself remained private. We should also consider contraception. Yes, it existed. The ancient Egyptians documented various methods to prevent pregnancy, many of which sound uncomfortable. Pessaries made from crocodile dung and honey, linen soaked in acacia leaves, and other herbal concoctions were inserted into the vagina to block or neutralize sperm. Some of these may have had actual spermicidal properties, others likely not. But the point is that they tried. Birth control was not a modern invention, it was a necessity for those who understood well the consequences of pregnancy and a world with high mortality rates. Sexual health was also a concern. Medical papyri like the Cahun Gynecological Papyrus lists symptoms and treatments for vaginal infections, infertility, and complications during childbirth. These documents rarely mention male pleasure, focusing instead on reproduction and women's bodily complaints. There are references to painful menstruation, irregular discharge, and anatomical observations that indicate a surprising level of empirical knowledge, albeit couched in spiritual or magical language. And what about same-sex relationships? The evidence is ambiguous. There is a famous tomb of two men, Nile and Khnumhotep, discovered near Saqqara, where the men are depicted in an embrace traditionally reserved for married couples. Some scholars believe they were lovers, others that they were twins or close friends. Egyptian culture may not have had the same categories or prejudices as our sexual identity was less rigidly labeled. What mattered was fertility, order, and social harmony, so long as the social roles were maintained. Private desire may not have been policed with moral intensity. This brings us to the institution of prostitution. It existed, as it has in nearly every society, but was neither revered nor entirely reviled. Some women likely operated independently, others in service to taverns or wealthier households. There is mention of women of the street and singers of the house, euphemisms that leave much to interpretation. Some were musicians, dancers, or entertainers who may have also offered sexual services. It was not a profession of high status, but it was also not illegal or hidden in shame. Again, context mattered. A woman selling bread in the morning might sell her company in the evening, and few would raise an eyebrow. Virginity, in contrast to some later cultures, was not obsessively valued. There are no surviving texts obsessing over a woman's purity at marriage. What mattered more was whether a woman could bear children, manage a household, and contribute to family honor. And men, they were expected to be discreet. Infidelity might occur, but the social order had to be preserved. Adultery wasn't about passion, it was about disruption. and for that reason, it could lead to public humiliation or divorce, though not always. Speaking of divorce, it was entirely possible in ancient Egypt and relatively easy. A woman could initiate separation and written contracts from later periods, show equitable arrangements regarding property and child custody. There was no sense of lifelong binding vows under divine scrutiny. Marriage was practical, built around economics, inheritance, and survival, and yet affection was clearly present. Love poems, statues of couples buried together, and letters found in tombs all suggest that genuine bonds often developed. The emotional reality of sex, the tenderness, jealousy, longing, contentment was as real then as now. Not so. What was sex like in ancient Egypt? It was earthy, strategic sometimes, joyful, often routine. It was ritualized and yet intimate, private and yet poetic. It wasn't the stuff of modern fantasies or salacious legend, but rather the fabric of life woven into daily routine, biological urgency, and the quiet hope of new life. The most important aspect wasn't passion or pleasure, it was continuity, keeping the family line alive, honoring the gods, and maintaining the order of math, the cosmic balance of all things. And yet, as you picture the moon rising over the Nile, the soft shuffle of linen garments in the night, and the scent of lotus wine wafting on the breeze, one question lingers quietly in the dark. If so much of sex was ordinary and practical, what did the ancient Egyptians dream about when they longed for more? If you walked through an ancient Egyptian village at dusk, past the open courtyards and woven reed fences, past the silhouettes of clay jars cooling in the breeze and linen drying on wooden posts, you might overhear the low murmurs of domestic life, children settling down, a neighbor calling out over a shared wall, a woman humming a lullaby. What you would not hear is talk of sex, not because it was forbidden, but because it was unspoken, nested in gestures, cloaked in metaphor, wrapped in daily rhythms and privacy. For the ancient Egyptians, the sexual world was not a mystery, but it was a boundary, one that was understood to exist behind the veil of personal dignity and cosmic order. You might expect a society so rich in sensual imagery and myth to be more publicly expressive of sexuality. But in truth, Egyptian culture valued mat, the principle of balance, over indulgence. Mat governed not only the seasons and the stars, but also social behavior. To live harmoniously meant to know your place, your duties, and the roles of your body, when to show it, when to hide it, when to use it, and when to protect it. There was a time for pleasure, but that time was never meant to disrupt the delicate patterns of life. That doesn't mean pleasure didn't matter. In fact, the archaeological record suggests that ancient Egyptians took great care in enhancing their intimate lives, from cosmetics and oils to perfumes and jewelry. Sensuality was cultivated with intention. Sexuality was not repressed, but it was organized, understood within a spiritual and medical framework that made it both accessible and controlled. Let's begin with personal grooming. Ancient Egyptians were meticulous about their bodies. Hair was often shaved or closely trimmed, not just for cleanliness, but for symbolic reasons: purity, discipline, ritual cleanliness. Wigs were worn by men and women alike, especially in the upper classes. These wigs weren't just fashion, they were sometimes scented, laced with cones of perfumed fat that would melt slowly in the sun, releasing fragrance through the day. Imagine a lover returning home in the evening, the aroma of lotus oil still lingering in their hair, skin smooth with almond balm, and eyes outlined in black coal, not only to ward off spirits, but to draw in a gaze. It was in this attention to detail that desire lived, not in public display, but in cultivated anticipation. Ancient Egyptian love poetry speaks of longing not through physical description, but through metaphorized like fishnets, kisses like honey, hands trembling as reeds in the flood. One famous poem from the Chester Beatty Papyrus reads, "My heart flutters hastily. When I think of your love, it lets me not act sensibly. It leaps from its place." These were not verses passed around by bored nobles. They were performed possibly sung, perhaps even whispered beneath window screens or in gardens shaded by date palms. These poems reveal not only the emotional dimensions of desire, but the structure of courtship, an experience rooted in mutual admiration, physical attraction, and silent permission. Indeed, consent was essential. Unlike some later cultures, there is no overwhelming evidence that women in ancient Egypt were viewed as property. Legal texts show women owning land, initiating divorce, and making contracts. While patriarchy certainly existed, it was often softened by a pragmatic respect for female agency, especially in domestic matters. A woman's sexual consent, at least in theory, was presumed to matter. This was especially important in matters of fertility. Egyptian medicine was deeply invested in reproductive health. Papyri like the Ebers and Kahun documents list dozens of treatments for infertility, methods for identifying pregnancy, and even recipes for predicting the sex of a child. One test involved placing barley and emmer wheat in urine. If one sprouted, it indicated pregnancy. If the barley grew first, it was a boy, while scientifically suspect. The ritual nature of these practices reveals a cultural intimacy with the body's cycles. When sex failed to result in children, couples might turn to magical remedies, amulets shaped like Hathor cows, prayers inscribed on linen, or offerings made to fertility deities like bees and Tarit. These gods were not glamorous, they were squat, sometimes grotesque, protective. Bees, for example, was a dwarf god who guarded sleeping mothers and frightened away demons with his wild face. And lion's mane. It was to these humble figures that people turned when sex became complicated, when it wasn't just about desire, but destiny. And what about sex that existed outside of marriage? Was it punished, hidden, or ignored? The answer, again, lies in the details. Adultery was taken seriously not because of moral outrage, but because of property and legacy. If a child was born from an affair, inheritance lines could be disrupted. For women, especially, accusations of adultery could lead to divorce or public disgrace. The punishment wasn't always severe, it depended on class, location, and social standing. In many cases, disputes were settled privately, with little interference from the state. There are even records of court cases involving sexual assault. One particularly grim example from the New Kingdom period involves a man punished with mutilation for attempting rape. This suggests that bodily autonomy was protected under the law, at least on paper. That said, as in all ancient societies, power could distort justice. A nobleman's offense might go unpunished, while a farmer's indiscretion could cost him his home. The line between seduction and coercion was just as murky then as it is now. Prostitution, too, sat in a gray area. Though the temples of ancient Egypt were sacred spaces, there is little evidence that they housed sexual rites or sacred prostitutes, as some older theories claimed. More often, sex work occurred in urban taverns, small, smoky rooms where beer flowed and songs were sung. Women there may have traded company for coins or grain. They weren't necessarily shamed, but neither were they honored. Egyptian society tended to let such things exist quietly, unacknowledged in official texts but visible in daily life. What is particularly fascinating is how Egyptian society used humor and satire to explore sexual themes. On ostraka scraps of pottery used for sketching, or note-taking artists sometimes drew caricatures of sexual activity. These weren't serious documents. They were the ancient equivalent of dirty jokes. One drawing shows a woman balancing a beer jar while engaging in intercourse, possibly mocking tavern workers or commenting on excess. Such pieces were never displayed publicly. They were found in workers' villages, tucked between the discarded shells of paint palettes and broken chisels. Even these casual depictions had their rules. There was a difference between nudity for humor and nudity for sacred symbolism. In funerary art, for example, women were sometimes shown with exposed breasts not for erotic effect, but to represent nurturing, rebirth, and motherhood. The nude female form was not obscene, it was emblematic of life itself. Context was everything. And while we're speaking of funerary practice, it's worth noting how the Egyptians imagined intimacy in the afterlife. In many tombs, couples are depicted holding hands, embracing, or even seated side by side in serene companionship. These weren't erotic scenes, they were promises to be reunited with one's partner beyond death, to continue the domestic peace and quiet affection of earthly marriage was a common hope. Sexuality wasn't a flame that burned out, it was a thread woven into the soul's eternal journey. Even the architecture of homes hints at sexual privacy. Mudbrick houses typically included a main room, a sleeping area, and a small private space where valuables or intimacy could be hidden. Beds were elevated from the ground with woven reed matting and pillows of wood or leather. Curtains might separate spaces, and lamps were made from fired clay with a cotton wick dipped in oil. Imagine the shadows these lamps cast, flickering, slow-moving, the kind of light that softens edges and quiets breath. Still, there are mysteries. We don't fully understand the role of dreams in ancient Egyptian sexuality, though some texts hint at prophetic visions involving union with gods or goddesses. Erotic dreams may have been viewed as both warning and blessing, a signal of divine attention or emotional imbalance. Like so much in Egyptian life, dreams belong to the realm between the physical and spiritual, never fully deciphered. There is, too, the matter of sexual orientation. Modern labels fail to map neatly onto ancient lives. Did the Egyptians recognize same-sex attraction? Almost certainly. Did they label it, categorize it, or politicize it? Likely not. Their concern was not with identity, but with behavior, lineage, and cosmic order. What mattered was whether one's actions upheld Maat. If a relationship created harmony, it was acceptable. If it led to chaos, jealousy, scandal, conflict, it was not. In that way, sexuality was less a personal expression and more a public negotiation. The boundaries of desire were marked not by sin, but by social consequence. A tryst could be innocent or devastating, depending on its effect on family, neighbors, inheritance, and honor. Love was not free, but it was not punished either. It simply had to find its place. And what of those who never married? Spinsters, widowers, scribes too busy for courtship. The records are mostly silent, but we do have letters, occasional notes from a son to his mother, from a worker to his friend, mentioning loneliness, the burdens of solitude, the ache for companionship. These are not dramatic declarations, but small admissions. They remind us that beyond the gods and glyphs, the pyramids and perfume, there were people, quiet, longing people, just like you. So now, as you rest your thoughts beside the gentle currents of the Nile, the soft reed walls casting shadows across the cool stone floor, one question remains unanswered. If the Egyptians built eternity on order and balance, what did they do with the passions that refused to stay quiet? At the threshold of death, when the body was swathed in linen and the last incense burned in a darkened room, the ancient Egyptians believed the soul began a journey. But this journey was not merely a passage through darkness, it was a reawakening of the senses. The afterlife, for them, was not abstract paradise. It was a mirror of life, only better. There would be fields of barley to walk through barefoot. There would be bread, beer, figs, and clean linen. There would be music, and for many, perhaps most, there would also be love. If you visit tombs from the New Kingdom, you might find frescoes of couples reclining together beneath fruit trees. The men and women are not young, yet they are serene, holding each other's hands, sometimes with arms resting over shoulders in a gesture that is both romantic and domestic. These scenes are often overlooked by tourists who seek grander monuments, but these simple painted gestures tell us more about Egyptian values than an entire stone column could. Intimacy was not just sacred, it was eternal. This final section explores how sexuality, partnership, and desire followed ancient Egyptians beyond death. how these human connections were recorded in tombs, expressed in rituals, and even entangled in the divine. Let us start with the most powerful metaphor of union in ancient Egypt, the story of Osiris and Isis. According to the myth, Osiris, the beloved king and symbol of order, was murdered and dismembered by his jealous brother, Set. Isis, his devoted wife, gathered his scattered pieces, restoring him through magic and mourning. In one of the most tender and eerie details, Isis is said to have reassembled Osiris's body entirely except for one piece, his phallus, which had been swallowed by a fish. She crafted a new one, revived her husband through spell and breath, and conceived a child Horus. This myth is central not just to Egyptian religion, but to their entire cosmology. Sex here is not simply procreation, it is resurrection. Desire does not die, it restores. It reorders the world, even in death. The bond between Isis and Osiris redefines time and body and legacy. That is why tombs were more than graves. They were bedchambers for eternity. Consider the tomb of Ramos in Hatnafer, a modest burial site for a non-royal couple. Inside are painted scenes of daily life, Hatnafer grinding grain, Ramos writing on papyrus, both offering food to one another. There are no overtly sexual scenes, but the entire composition breathes intimacy. The Egyptians believed that if you painted or carved something in your tomb, you would experience it in the afterlife. These quiet domestic moments, acts of mutual support were, in a way, the sexual afterlife. Love, for them, was sustained not by fireworks but by repetition, care, and presence. Yet sexuality in Egypt was not always about the couple. Sometimes it was chaotic, transgressive, and sacred in the most disorienting ways. Nowhere is this clearer than in the role of divine sexuality. Some deities were overtly sexual, embodying aspects of lust, fertility, and the ecstatic body. Hathor, goddess of love, beauty, music, and drunkenness, was often shown naked or semi-nude. Her festivals involved music, dance, and likely intoxication. In fact, at the festival of drunkenness celebrated annually, near Thebes, participants drank large amounts of beer to enter altered states and become closer to the divine. But this wasn't a bacchanal in the modern sense. The goal wasn't abandon, but alignment. By becoming intoxicated, people could open themselves to divine visions. Hathor, the cosmic mother and seductress, was not only a goddess of fertility, she was the one who soothed the raging gods, who restored balance through joy, pleasure, and connection. Another figure, Men, was a fertility god worshipped with unmistakable symbols and erect phallus. Lettuce offerings believed to have aphrodisiac properties and ritual celebrations of male virility. His worship involved processions with statues, chants, and sacred gestures. But even here, sex was not pornographic, it was agricultural, spiritual, powerful. The land would be fertile if the gods were pleased. The man's body, in ritual form, became the vessel of the land's future. Still, not all stories of intimacy in ancient Egypt were so revered. There are rare but startling examples of sexual behavior crossing into taboo. The Turin Erotic Papyrus, dating to around 1150 BCE, is perhaps the most infamous. Unlike formal depictions of love or ritualized fertility symbols, this scroll is a series of erotic illustrations, explicit, humorous, exaggerated. Women are shown in compromising positions, men with exaggerated genitalia, some with gray hair, and beer bellies. Scholars debate its purpose. Was it satire? Pornography? A temple worker's private joke? Whatever its intention, it reveals that Egyptian society was not blind to the extremes of sexual expression. Even the culture of Mat had its shadows. More disturbingly, the historical record includes sparse mentions of incestuous unions, especially among royalty. Pharaohs sometimes married their sisters or daughters, not purely out of lust, but to preserve divine bloodlines. In doing so, They mirrored the gods, particularly Isis and Osiris, who were siblings. To modern eyes, these practices are troubling. Yet in the cosmological mind of ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was not just king. He was divine. His body was a symbol. His union with his sister was not incest, it was cosmic balance. Among commoners, such pairings were extremely rare. The ordinary Egyptian married outside the immediate family, usually within their social class. Marriage, in fact, was remarkably egalitarian in many respects. Women retained their personal property after marriage. They could initiate divorce. Love letters survive in which men and women address each other as equals. One letter, from a scribe to his wife, ends with a line so simple. It collapses the centuries between us. You are my sister, and I love you more than my own life. There, again, we see the use of sister as a term of endearment, not literal, but poetic, layered with affection and respect. Egyptian romantic language often blurred the lines between familial and romantic love. To call your partner sister or brother was to evoke closeness, trust, and eternal kinship. This view of sex as both private and transcendent, mortal and divine, is perhaps why the Egyptians approached death not with fear, but with preparation. The Book of the Dead is filled with spells for the body, how to walk, breathe, eat, and yes, even embrace in the afterlife. The soul ball was imagined as a bird with a human head, capable of flying between tomb and sky, returning to the body at night. That meant that even in death, the body needed to be intact, comfortable, recognizable. Couples were often buried close together or even in the same tomb so their boss spirits could reunite. And yet, not everyone had such peace. In Deir el-Medina, the village of tomb builders, a fragment of a letter was discovered where a man accuses his lover of betrayal. He claims she visited another man. He writes, "You did not wait for me. The door was not bolted. You went in like a thief. But I lit the lamp for you every night." There is pain there. Not mythic pain, not the drama of Osiris and Isis, but human heartbreak. The heartbreak of someone who gave their affection and who was forgotten when the moon rose. What strikes us about this fragment is not just the emotional clarity, but the fact that it was written at all. The ancient Egyptians left us pyramids, yes, but also letters, poems, graffiti, and jokes. They worried about infidelity. They snuck away to quiet corners. They offered each other tokens, not just gold, but figs and perfume and pressed petals. They made love with care. And when they could no longer speak of it aloud, they carved it into tombs, painted it behind doors, and whispered it into eternity. So what was sex really like in ancient Egypt? It was less about spectacle and more about intimacy. It was spiritual, without being prudish, practical without being mechanical. It was understood as a force that could heal or destroy, that could bind couples for eternity or undo a royal line. It was sometimes beautiful, sometimes brutal, often private, and always woven into the fabric of life. Even today, the Nile winds past the broken columns and desert hills. The wind carries secrets. The temples are quiet now, but if you stand still long enough, you might imagine the scent of oil, the rustle of linen, the hush of footsteps in the dusk. And in that stillness, one final thought lingers. If love was meant to echo beyond death, what forgotten voices still call out to be heard? From beneath the sand, the burning of Washington, 1814. You are in Washington, D.C., but not the Washington of monuments, marble, and motorcades. It is the summer of 1814, and the city is more idea than reality, muddy, half-built, and unnervingly quiet. The air smells of river silt and unfinished timber. Horses outnumber carriages. There are stumps where avenues should be, and goats wander freely past the Capitol, which itself is only half complete. There are no grand vistas yet, no fountains or symmetrical rows of cherry trees, just open land, humid air, and a lingering feeling that the capital of the United States might have been declared too early. This is a city in the making, And the War of 1812, often called the Forgotten War, is no longer just a column in the newspaper. It's creeping closer. Still, too many Washingtonians in that strange, hot summer. The war seems far away. The British are preoccupied with Napoleon, aren't they? Surely they won't bother sending more troops across the ocean just to make a point. And yet, while the politicians dither and the heat thickens, the British are preparing something entirely different across the Atlantic, a symbolic blow, not just against soldiers or ports, but against the very center of American democracy, against its capital. But for now, the city breathes slowly. The danger has not yet arrived. Let's linger in this moment and see what life was like in a capital that had barely begun. The population of Washington in 1814 was less than 10,000 people. It was, by all standards, a village with pretensions. The Capitol dome didn't exist yet. In fact, the Capitol itself was still to mismatched wings, the middle only a dream. The Library of Congress. It was just a few shelves tucked into a room of the Capitol building. Pennsylvania Avenue was a wide path of dirt, often impassable in spring due to mud, and thick with mosquitoes in summer. There were no proper sidewalks. People walked through fields to get from one building to another. Fog rolled in off the Potomac River most mornings. Cabinet members lived in modest boarding houses, and sometimes ran into each other over breakfast eggs, weak coffee, molasses bread before walking to the barely functioning government buildings. President James Madison often walked the streets without an escort. His wife, Dolly, was more recognizable, famous for her parties and for helping define the role of First Lady in a way no one before her had done. It was a capital defined more by aspiration than reality. The government of the United States in 1814 was still, in many ways, experimental. The White House, then known simply as the President's House, was whitewashed but not grand. It had drafty halls, a leaky roof, and only a few pieces of decent furniture. It didn't even have an iron fence yet. Cows sometimes wandered onto the lawn, and yet the people believed in it. What they did not believe or could not quite accept was that war would come here. The War of 1812 had begun under a haze of confusion and overconfidence. American politicians believed that by invading Canada, then a British colony, they could force concessions. But the war dragged on. The Navy had some early wins, but the British blockade of American ports crippled trade. The British, preoccupied with Napoleon until mid-1814, had finally turned their full attention to the Americans. In the Chesapeake Bay, British ships had begun making raids on small towns. At first, they burned minor ports, stole supplies, and left quickly. Locals watched from their fields as British soldiers disembarked, marched in orderly columns, and then vanished as quickly as they came. Panic flared, but only briefly. Most believed the real cities, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Washington, were too well defended to be at risk. They were wrong. A British general named Robert Ross and a naval officer, Admiral George Cockburn, had been given a plan: strike at the American capital, not to hold it, not to occupy it, but to shame it. The goal was symbolic: show the world that even the American seat of government could burn. Back in Washington, preparations were minimal. Secretary of War John Armstrong dismissed the idea that the British would attack the capital. They wouldn't come here, he reportedly said, because it is of no use. His assumption was that Baltimore, a major port and shipbuilding city, was a far more strategic target. Washington, he believed, was not worth burning. And so, as summer deepened and the fields browned under the sun, life continued. Congress met in its partially constructed chambers. Clerks copied notes with quill and ink. Government documents were stacked carelessly in offices. In one corner of the Capitol, construction continued, stone by stone, in the futile belief that peace would arrive before the enemy. Dolly Madison, ever the social heartbeat of Washington, continued to plan her dinners and teas. She had recently acquired a life-size portrait of George Washington painted by Gilbert Stuart. It hung in the dining room of the White House, a symbol of continuity between the new republic and its founding father. Dolly herself was a master of balance, charming both Federalists and Republicans, welcoming guests with grace, maintaining the illusion of calm as tensions mounted around her. Meanwhile, the British moved. On August 19, 1814, a British force of about 4,500 men landed at Benedict, Maryland, on the Patuxent River. It was hot, over 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and the roads were bad, but they began marching inland. American scouts watched, but confusion reigned. Where were they going? Would they head toward Baltimore or simply raid a few supply depots? The American defense was scattered and amateur. General William Winder, who had little experience and few resources, was charged with protecting the city. He assembled a ragtag force of militia, farmers, shopkeepers, and a few professional soldiers. They were poorly trained and poorly armed. Worse, they didn't know where the British were headed. On August 23rd, word reached Washington that the British might be moving toward the capital. Still, Secretary Armstrong scoffed. The city had no fortifications, no standing army, no naval guns. But the Potomac was too shallow for heavy ships, and the roads into town were thought to be too treacherous for a full-scale invasion. Besides, it was Washington. The city was barely finished. Surely the British would want to burn something more polished. But Washington was never about polish. It was about symbolism. And in that, it was a perfect target. On the morning of August 24, the British Army met the Americans at Bladensburg, just northeast of Washington. It was not a battle, it was a rout. The American militia fled under heavy fire. Some dropped their muskets before even firing a shot. President Madison himself had ridden out to observe the defense. Now he fled with his entourage, leaving behind orders but little hope. The road to Washington lay open. That afternoon, as smoke from the battle drifted into the distance, Washington emptied. Government clerks scrambled to evacuate files. Dolly Madison packed silverware, state papers, and the Washington portrait. She ordered it to be taken down and hidden, a detail that would later become legend. She did not flee in panic, but in haste. Her carriage loaded with what fragments of the Republic she could carry. By nightfall, British troops marched into the city unopposed. They did not loot. They did not harm civilians. Instead, they moved with brutal, symbolic precision. They entered the Capitol building and set fire to the Senate and House chambers. The books of the Library of Congress went up in flames. Then they turned to the White House. Soldiers reportedly dined on food left half-eaten from Dolly's Last Supper, drank the president's wine, and then torched the building. Flames reached high into the night. The light could be seen for miles. The next day, the British burned the Treasury, the War Department, and other public buildings. They avoided private homes, targeting only the government. Then, as if their message had been made, they left. The storm struck soon after, perhaps a hurricane, perhaps just a violent summer thunderstorm. Rain lashed the burning city. A tornado tore through the streets, ripping roofs from houses and flinging cannons. Some claimed it was divine retribution. Others believed it was simply the climate reminding everyone of its indifference. When the smoke cleared, Washington stood scorched. The Capitol's stone walls remained, blackened and hollow. The White House was a shell. Streets were littered with charred wood, broken glass, and papers singed and flapping in the wind. And yet the Republic endured. Congress reconvened weeks later in temporary quarters. Madison returned. The portrait of George Washington had been saved. The people who had fled trickled back, and slowly, the rebuilding began, not just of buildings, but of confidence still. In that first breath after the smoke, one question lingered more than any other. How did a nation so fiercely born allow its very heart to be so completely unguarded? You wake to the sound of hammering, not the determined hammer of reconstruction, but the awkward thuds of carpenters converting a hotel into a seat of government. It is early September 1814, barely 2 weeks since Washington burned. The charred beams of the Capitol still smolder, and the shell of the president's house is open to the sky, its roof consumed by fire. Its interior is blackened like the husk of a burned log. The smell of ash and damp plaster still lingers in the air, and yet somehow, the government must carry on. They have found temporary shelter at a building called Blodgett's Hotel, a long, utilitarian structure in Washington that had once been a theater, a patent office, and a boarding house. Now, it was repurposed as the lifeboat for a government with no home. The American Republic, barely 38 years old, was doing its best to pretend nothing had happened. But every day began with reminders of what had been lost. Inside Blodgett's, the House of Representatives met in a second-floor hall, where a thick red curtain divided the chamber from a space still used as a makeshift stage. The acoustics were terrible. The air was close. Desks were scavenged from nearby buildings. One congressman remarked that he could still smell the scent of dried oranges from the theater's past life. Another complained that the mice were bolder than the politicians. But it was here that laws were debated and budgets were balanced. Because even after the Capitol burned, the mail still needed to be delivered, the military still needed to be paid, and someone had to figure out how to rebuild what had been so publicly destroyed. Rebuilding was not a given. There were voices in Congress, mostly Northern delegates, who argued that Washington had always been a bad idea. They pointed to its swampy geography, its scattered layout, and its vulnerability. Philadelphia, they said, had been a better capital, or maybe New York. Washington had no natural defenses, no population to rally, and no symbolic weight outside of its political institutions. Others disagreed. The South, for one, liked the capital's location because it was geographically favorable to their states, and there was pride. 2. Moving the capital would be an admission of failure, a statement that the grand experiment had stumbled so badly it needed to retreat. President Madison, ever the quiet constitutionalist, believed that abandoning Washington would fracture the still young Union in ways that might never heal. So the decision was made: rebuild. Not just because they had to, but because not rebuilding would be worse. And here began the long, slow, and deeply unglamorous process of putting the Capitol back together. The White House would not be reoccupied for nearly 4 years. The Capitol would take even longer. Contractors had to be found, stone had to be imported, and funds had to be approved. Nothing moved quickly. Bricks needed to be recast. Plans had to be redrawn. And in the absence of a proper archive system, some of the original architectural documents had to be guessed at from memory. Congress debated each expense. Could they afford $60,000 for stonework? Was it appropriate to build a new dome when soldiers needed boots? The very idea of beauty in architecture was questioned. Wasn't the function of government more important than how it looked? But the Madison administration quietly insisted form mattered. The buildings had been burned not because of their military utility, but because of what they symbolized. And so they needed to return not just structurally, but aesthetically. The dome, the rotunda, the colonnades, these were not extravagances. They were declarations that the Republic remained. And yet, the day-to-day work of governance was still deeply mundane. Inside the temporary halls of Congress, lawmakers argued about tariffs, debated conscription, and squabbled over how much back pay was owed to militia members who had fled at the Battle of Bladensburg. Clerks sat hunched over desks, copying out legislation by candlelight. The ink smelled slightly of iron. Paper supplies were limited. Some notes were scribbled on reused pages of shipping manifests or old correspondence. Meanwhile, the streets of Washington were a mix of quiet despair and anxious labor. Builders walked through the Capitol ruins, taking measurements. Dolly Madison, though displaced, continued her correspondence and organized morale-boosting dinners wherever she could. She had evacuated to Virginia after the burning, but she remained an icon. Her calm charisma helping to frame the disaster as survivable. In private letters, she was less composed, expressing sorrow over the destruction of her home, and especially the loss of government documents, furniture, and the personal items that had filled the president's house with meaning. But what is rarely remembered is how boring the rebuilding was. There were no grand speeches, no triumphant marches, just endless meetings, disagreements about stone color, and slow deliveries of timber. Rain delayed progress. Workers argued over pay. Some materials arrived from as far as New England, while others had to be quarried locally. Under difficult conditions, roads were still bad. Wagons broke down. Horses had to be fed and watered daily. And through it all, the specter of the British remained. Although the British had departed after their brief occupation, they had not disappeared from American waters. Their navy continued to patrol the Chesapeake, and the threat of another strike kept the capital on edge. Baltimore, in particular, braced itself. With its port, shipyards, and privateer fleet, Baltimore was a logical target. But unlike Washington, it was better defended. In fact, just weeks after the capital burned, the British launched their assault on Baltimore, culminating in the Battle of Fort McHenry, a moment now immortalized in Francis Scott Key's poem, later turned anthem. Washingtonians followed news of the siege with bated breath. If Baltimore fell, the entire eastern seaboard might follow. But Baltimore held. The failure of the British to take Fort McHenry marked a turning point. American morale, so fragile after the sack of Washington, began to recover. The government sensed a shift, and with that shift came renewed focus. Washington would not just be rebuilt, it would be reborn. And this time with intention. The process of funding that rebirth remained messy. One proposal included selling off federal lands to raise cash. Another suggested diverting funds from Western expansion efforts. Arguments erupted over how much should be spent on rebuilding versus fortifying. What good were new walls? One senator asked. If they could be torched again. These were not rhetorical questions. Every brick placed in the new capital had to be justified not just in budget, but in purpose. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens of the capital tried to make do. Some people lived in tents for months, their homes destroyed in the fires or damaged in the storm that followed. Chimneys stood like tombstones on otherwise empty lots. Storekeepers rebuilt counters using salvaged wood. One printer published newspapers from the back of a wagon. Churches opened their doors to displaced families. Taverns became meeting points not just for drinks, but for informal governance where plans were made in low voices and rumors spread faster than facts. And through it all, the national identity quietly evolved. The burning of Washington had been a humiliation. That much was clear. But it also became a sort of galvanizing welder reminder of what it meant to be American. Not in glory, but in endurance. The government did not fall. The Constitution did not collapse. Even in exile, Congress functioned. The president governed. The courts continued. Perhaps most tellingly, the Washington portrait Dolly had saved remained one of the few visible symbols of national continuity. Hung later in the restored president's house, it was a statement not just of survival, but of preservation, that even amid fire and flight, some things remained worth saving. In London, British officials downplayed the attack. They had bigger concerns. Napoleon had returned from Elba in 1815, and Europe once again stood on the brink of chaos. The War of 1812 would soon wind down, not with a resounding American victory, but with a negotiated peace. The Treaty of Ghent, signed in December 1814. By the time the treaty was ratified, Washington was still half in ruins. Still, there were reasons for cautious optimism. By early 1815, plans for a new dome were circulating. Architects debated proportions, sculptors carved cornices and friezes. More importantly, there was now political consensus. Washington would remain the capital. Its flame-scorched bones would be strengthened, not replaced. The fires had not erased the government, they had etched it deeper into the national psyche. But this raises a quiet, uncomfortable question, one that buzzed beneath every committee meeting, every hammer blow, and every whispered conversation. Over weak coffee in Blodgett's hotel, was the United States lucky the British only meant to shame the man not to stay? You return to Washington in 1817. The city looks unfinished, not in the chaotic, fire-charred way it did in the aftermath of the British invasion, but in that particular way cities always seem when they're growing faster than they can be organized. Piles of bricks line the roads. Plaster dust settles on window panes. The Capitol dome is not yet completed, and in the air is something hard to define, part weariness, part quiet resolve. It has been nearly 3 years since British forces marched down Pennsylvania Avenue, torches in hand. 3 years since the president's house was gutted, the Capitol burned, and government men sat hunched over borrowed desks in temporary rooms. In that time, something strange has happened. The burning that was once a symbol of national shame has become almost paradoxically a symbol of survival. The war ended not with American conquest, but with a treaty signed far away in Ghent, Belgium. The Treaty of Ghent restored borders to their pre-war lines, leaving many Americans to wonder what, if anything, had been gained. But there was one thing that had undoubtedly changed. The country had proven it could endure humiliation without disintegrating, and that counted for something. James Madison, who had quietly suffered perhaps more than any other figure during the crisis, returned to office with his head high in 1815 as a sign of confidence and reconciliation. He personally moved back into the president's house even though it was still being restored. The building had been gutted by flame and blackened by smoke, but the thick stone walls had held. Repairs were underway. A new portico had been planned. The south wing remained scaffolded, draped with canvas to protect it from the weather. Dolly Madison, ever gracious in public, resumed her role as hostess. Yet the woman who had once fled with a rolled-up portrait of George Washington and a plate of silver from the White House now walked its rebuilt halls with quieter steps. She hosted dinners, entertained dignitaries, and took part in shaping the social rhythms of post-war Washington. But in her letters, there remained an undercurrent of melancholy. The fire had taken more than furnishings. It had scorched her sense of permanence. The rebuilding of Washington was not just physical, it was psychological. Across the city, symbols of restoration appeared. The Capitol, still under construction, became a focus of national pride. Architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe, who had worked on the original Capitol design, was called back to oversee its resurrection. He introduced modifications to improve fire resistance, including fireproof vaults and stone staircases. Yet progress was maddeningly slow. Congressional committees had to approve every budget line, every alteration. Stonecutters, masons, and plasterers were in short supply. Materials had to be sourced, many from distant quarries. Labor was expensive. There were debates over architectural styles. Should the new dome be Roman or Gothic? Would the statues evoke classical ideals or something more American? And then there were the practical matters. Roofing materials had to be weatherproof. New heating systems were proposed. Ventilation had to be improved. Congress, for all its lofty ideals, still wanted warm feet in winter. Meanwhile, public confidence in the Capitol began to grow, not because Washington was an efficient city, but because it had become a symbolic one. Tourists, yes, even in the early 19th century, began to visit the ruins. They sketched the blackened Capitol walls. They wrote letters home describing the charred remains of the president's house. For some, it was a pilgrimage to the site where America had been humbled and then had begun to recover. One traveler called it a monument not of ruin, but of redemption. In a sense, the burning had given Washington an origin myth. Before the fire, it had been an incomplete capital designed on paper, built in mud, and inhabited by reluctant civil servants. After the fire, it was something more. It was the city that had been attacked and survived. The place that stood for an idea not because it was strong, but because it refused to vanish. And there was a broader irony. The British, who had intended to humiliate America, had instead unified it. The sack of Washington angered even those who had opposed the war. Citizens who had been indifferent to the conflict now donated to rebuilding funds. Newspapers that once criticized Madison now praised the dignity with which he had endured disaster. The burning was a shared wound, and shared wounds have a way of binding people together. But what of the ordinary citizens? What became of those who would watch the Capitol burn? Many had left in the initial panic but returned slowly. Bricklayers and carpenters found ample work. Some families moved into damaged homes and lived among scaffolds and sawdust. Children played in the ruins, turning burnt beams into makeshift seesaws. Churches held services in barns. Theaters doubled as lecture halls. There were tensions, of course. Money flowed inconsistently. Promised compensation for damages often arrived late or not at all. Poorer residents, especially free black families who had made homes in Washington's fringes, struggled to find affordable housing in a city that was still chaotic and uneven in its rebuilding. The fire had not changed the city's inequality. If anything, it had deepened it. And yet there was an odd sort of hopefulness in the air, a sense that this American experiment, however flawed, was moving forward smoke-stained, but not destroyed. By the end of the decade, the Capitol stood restored, larger, more imposing, more carefully detailed than before. A new rotunda crowned its center. Inside, murals depicted moments of national pride. The signing of the Declaration, the surrender at Yorktown. None showed the burning of the Capitol itself. That moment was too raw, too shameful, and yet, perhaps, too essential to forget. The President's house had been transformed. James Hoban, the original architect, returned to supervise repairs. The interiors were updated. New draperies were hung. A special shade of whitewash was applied to cover the scars of the fire, a process so thorough that the public began calling it the White House. The name stuck. It wasn't official yet, but it would be. The building that had once been just the President's house was reborn with a name and a kind of mythic purity. Foreign visitors began to take Washington more seriously. Diplomats who had once laughed at its provincial awkwardness now described it as a city rising from its own ashes. They still found it muddy and underpopulated, but there was something different now, an atmosphere of tenacity. By 1820, Washington was no longer a political compromise on the banks of the Potomac. It was the capital, not because it had the best roads or the largest population, but because it had burned and been rebuilt. Because the fire, rather than ending the story, had solidified it. And for all its historical significance, the burning of Washington also left behind a more subtle legacy. It changed how America thought about its government. No longer could the Republic imagine itself invincible. Its leaders had fled. Its buildings had burned. But the system had held. Congress kept meeting. The Constitution had not been abandoned. The courts had reopened. And slowly, life had resumed. The realization mattered. It meant that America did not need monuments to survive. It needed institutions. It needed citizens willing to rebuild, even when the work was tedious, or thankless, or slow. Which brings you to the strange, lingering feeling in the air. A feeling that, even as the city was restored, something invisible had also taken root, something more durable than marble or plaster. A kind of humility, because Washington had burned. And in that burning, it had been stripped of grandeur. For a brief moment, the Capitol had been nothing more than a few stone walls and a stubborn idea. And yet, somehow, that was enough. So the next time you walk past the Capitol or glance at the White House on a postcard, remember this. Both buildings stand not just because they were designed to be beautiful, but because people, ordinary, exhausted, determined people, refused to let them disappear. And though no statue marks the moment when the first brick was laid after the fire, perhaps that's fitting. For in the quiet work of rebuilding, of hauling timber, mixing mortar, and copying minutes by candlelight, the soul of Washington was reforged. And isn't it strange to think that what once felt like the end of the Republic was actually just the beginning of its memory? What medieval motherhood was really like. You are not walking through a castle or a bustling medieval town square. You are in a much quieter space, a small chamber, warm with the smell of rushes and wool, where the windows are covered with heavy cloth to block out light and wind. This is a birthing room, and in this moment, you are closer to life and death than any battlefield or courtly drama could ever bring you. To be pregnant in the Middle Ages was not a private affair. It was a deeply communal, highly ritualized, and often perilous condition. From the moment a woman suspected she was with child, though, there were no pregnancy tests, just missed cycles, nausea, or dreams. Her body became a matter of religious, domestic, and social significance. Everyone had a stake in what happened next. Her husband, her priest, her neighbors, even the local wise woman. The most surprising thing, perhaps, is how little was truly understood about reproduction. Medieval medical knowledge was largely based on the writings of ancient Greek and Roman thinkers like Galen and Hippocrates, filtered through Arabic translations and Christian reinterpretation. According to one widely accepted theory, a woman's womb could wander around her body if she remained unmarried, or did not bear children soon enough, causing illness, madness, or even death. That idea may sound absurd now, but it shaped how women were treated. Pregnancy was not only expected, it was necessary for both health and salvation. A woman who could not conceive might be labeled barren, cursed, or even morally suspect. Her value, especially among the peasantry and lower nobility, was often tied to her ability to produce heirs or future workers. Even among wealthier families, a wife who failed to provide sons might find herself quietly replaced or blamed for her husband's political misfortunes. But suppose the woman does conceive. From that moment, she is caught between celebration and fear. The pregnancy itself would be observed with a mixture of religious awe and anxious caution. Prayers to Saint Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth, were common. Her story of surviving a demon attack while giving birth was seen as both miraculous and relatable. Images of her were painted or carved onto birthing stools, and amulets of her likeness were sometimes worn around the expectant mother's neck. The church had a strong presence in every stage of pregnancy. In fact, some clergymen advised that a woman confess her sins once she was noticeably pregnant, just in case she died during labor. Mortality rates were high, even among well-fed noble women. With access to the best care of the day, complications were common. Hemorrhaging, fever, or breech birth could easily prove fatal, especially in an era before sanitation, antibiotics, or surgical intervention. But there were women who specialized in helping others navigate this danger. The midwives. Medieval midwives occupied a strange and precarious position. They were trusted members of the community, trained through experience and tradition rather than formal education. They delivered babies, yes, but they also performed rituals, offered herbal remedies, and interpreted dreams. Many were illiterate, yet they carried more practical knowledge than many physicians. Midwives were expected to be moral, God-fearing, and discreet. They were often older women, sometimes widows, who had raised children of their own. And although they were valued for their skills, they lived under the constant shadow of suspicion. If a baby died during delivery or if the mother did, the midwife could be accused of witchcraft or malpractice. The line between healer and heretic was thin. And so, when labor began, it was not just a medical event, it was a spiritual trial. The birthing room was often cleared of men. Female relatives and friends gathered, curtains were drawn. The air was thick with incense and the murmuring of prayers. The woman in labor might grip wooden figures of saints or clutch cloths soaked in holy water. Some households prepared birth girdles, long ribbons with prayers inscribed on them. which were wrapped around the woman's belly in the hopes of easing delivery. Noise was discouraged. There was a belief that the unborn child could be frightened by shouting or sudden movements, and there was another, more practical reason. Too much noise might draw unwanted attention from neighbors or, worse, ecclesiastical authorities, especially if the household was known for its use of charms, chants, or non-Christian healing rituals. As contractions intensified, midwives might massage the belly with warm oil or apply pressure to encourage the child's descent. Herbal mixtures containing mugwort, pennyroyal, or rue were common. Some were meant to relieve pain. Others were supposed to stimulate contractions. Few of these methods were reliably safe. Sometimes, if labor dragged on for too long, priests were called to perform emergency baptisms. This was not uncommon. Infants could be baptized in the womb by pouring holy water into the birth canal if there was fear the child might die before emerging. These were called baptisms in utero, and they were legally recognized in some church courts still. Even after birth, the danger was far from over. If the baby was stillborn, the mother often wept alone. There were no grief counselors or support groups if she survived, but the child did not. It was assumed to be God's will or a punishment for some hidden sin. A malformed infant might be seen as a divine warning. And if a woman had multiple stillbirths, some communities began to whisper. In peasant communities, where every extra pair of hands mattered, the loss of a child was not just emotional, it was economic. One less body to help gather firewood or tend sheep, one less future dowry or marriage alliance. In noble households, especially royal ones, the stakes were political. Entire succession crises have erupted from the stillbirth of a single prince. And then, in those lucky cases where both mother and child survived, there began the next ordeal. Confinement and CHU or CHING. New mothers were expected to observe a period of postnatal seclusion, often lasting 40 days, echoing the biblical period of purification after birth. During this time, the mother would rest indoors, limit visitors, and avoid church. She was seen as spiritually unclean, even if she had delivered safely. Only after a special ceremony, called churching, could she re-enter religious and social life. Churching was not punishment, it was a blessing. The priest would offer prayers of thanksgiving for her survival, and she would be welcomed back into the community. But the symbolism was unmistakable. Birth, while necessary, left a spiritual stain, and women, especially those who birthed children, were considered particularly close to the mysterious border between life and death. This mixture of reverence and suspicion followed medieval mothers everywhere. They were revered for their sacrifices, yet blamed for their failures. They were praised for their fertility, yet burdened with impossible expectations. They were central to the continuation of family, property, and king domain, yet often excluded from decision-making. And still, they endured, because the work of motherhood didn't end with birth. It was only just beginning. Feeding, swaddling, protecting a child through its most fragile early months. These were the daily concerns of every medieval mother, whether she lived in a manor or a mud-walled hut. But perhaps the most exhausting part of it all wasn't the danger or the pain, it was the uncertainty. Would the baby live through the night? Would she survive the next labor? Would the village midwife be available when her time came again? These were not passing worries. They were the rhythm of a woman's life, and so, medieval motherhood was not soft or sentimental. It was practical, prayerful, and perilous. It was shaped by faith and fear in equal measure. And despite the songs and paintings that celebrated mothers as icons of virtue, the truth was more grounded. They were women who bled, prayed, endured, and hoped, often, in silence. As you step back from that shadowy birthing room, ask yourself, what did these women think in the quiet hours after birth? When the room had cleared and the fire had died down, did they feel proud, exhausted, terrified, or were they already bracing for the next time the baby has arrived? The cries echo softly through the chamber. a sign of life in a world where silence could mean the worst. But the laboring mother, though relieved to hear that sound, is not allowed to rest long. The demands of medieval motherhood begin almost immediately. There are mouths to feed, rituals to observe, and a deeply uncertain future ahead. Let's begin with the most immediate challenge, feeding. In the Middle Ages, a mother who had just given birth was expected if physically able to breastfeed her child. This was not merely a matter of nourishment, it was also a spiritual and social duty. A woman's milk was considered a sacred, almost mystical substance, believed to carry both physical health and moral character. Church teachings, medical writings, and folklore all claimed that a child nursed at the breast would absorb not just nutrients, but the virtue of the mother. This belief placed tremendous importance on the character of the breastfeeding woman. If a mother died or could not nurse, families sometimes turned to wet nurses. But hiring one wasn't a casual choice. A wet nurse's personal habits, her diet, emotions, and even sexual activity were all scrutinized, as it was thought that her temperament could influence the baby's future behavior and personality. For noble families, wet nurses were common, even preferred. Nursing was seen as undignified or physically deforming to the upper-class body. But for most women, especially in peasant villages, there was no other option. They nursed because they had to. A baby too young to be weaned was unlikely to survive without access to breast milk. Animal milk, when used, was often contaminated, and feeding vessels like hollowed horns or clay bottles were difficult to sterilize. Infant mortality rates were alarmingly high. Even for a healthy baby, early life was full of danger. Common childhood diseases, dysentery, measles, whooping cough, smallpox swept through villages regularly, and medicine was rudimentary at best. Remedies might include honey, crushed herbs, or prayer. Physicians were rarely called for babies, and even midwives had limited tools once the child was born. If an infant fell ill, mothers could do little more than comfort and wait. But how did mothers respond to these ever-present threats? Did they grow emotionally distant, afraid to attach themselves to children who might not live? Some historians once believed so that medieval parents were cold or indifferent, preparing themselves for inevitable grief. But that view has slowly changed. More recent research into wills, letters, and religious texts reveals deep parental affection. Mothers wrote prayers for their children's safety. They sewed protective charms into swaddling cloth. They sang lullabies, many of which have survived in oral tradition. Emotional restraint may have been encouraged, especially among the upper classes. But sorrow was never absent. A mother who lost a child grieved no less fiercely than one today, though perhaps more quietly, with fewer social spaces in which to express it. Childbearing wasn't just emotional, it was also deeply physical. A newborn was wrapped tightly in swaddling bands, often for the first 9 months of life. This practice, believed to encourage proper growth and limb alignment, also made the baby easier to carry and protect. Swaddling may have also symbolized spiritual containment. The baby is a tiny soul being bound against the chaos of the world. Once a child grew past infancy, usually around age 2, discipline began. The medieval idea of childhood was very different from today's. Children were not seen as innocent cherubs, but rather as small, sinful beings in need of correction and guidance. This view came largely from the church, which believed that all humans were born with original sin. Mothers were expected to shape their children's behavior through both love and punishment. Spanking or scolding was not unusual. The goal wasn't cruelty, but preparation. Children needed to learn obedience, modesty, and religious devotion, virtues that would make them acceptable to both family and God. For girls, lessons in obedience often started early. They would learn household tasks alongside their mothers: spinning wool, baking bread, carrying water, or mending clothes. These weren't optional chores. They were essential to family survival. A daughter who could manage a household was an asset economically, socially, and in marriage. For boys, Expectations often diverged around age 7. Those born to craftsmen might begin apprenticeships. Peasant boys might herd animals or help in the fields. Noble sons, meanwhile, were sometimes sent away to be fostered in other households, often to learn courtly manners or military skills. For the mother, this could mean separation long before adulthood still. Many tasks in early childhood remain the mother's domain, keeping children safe from everyday hazards. Open hearths, hungry animals, contaminated water was constant, exhausting work, especially in peasant households, where multiple children shared cramped quarters, and supervision was limited by the demands of labor. A mother might leave her toddler tethered to a central post with a rope or set them in a wooden high chair to keep them from wandering off. And then there were the emotional burdens. Medieval mothers were expected to remain composed. They might lose one child to illness, another to famine, and a third to war and still continue tending fields, baking bread, or spinning cloth. Expressing grief openly could be seen as a lack of faith. Everything was understood in relation to divine will. If a child died, it was part of God's plan. If a child survived, it was God's mercy. That belief helped mothers endure, but it didn't mean they didn't ache in private. Spiritual life was a constant thread in medieval motherhood, teaching children their prayers, taking them to Mass, and marking religious festivals were part of raising a child well. Some children were dedicated to religious life from birth. If a mother had several sons, one might be offered to the church not only to save his soul, but to save family resources or seek favor with local clergy. And while we often picture medieval life as rural, let's not forget the cities. In urban households, children might work as apprentices or servants. Mothers in cities had to worry about more than illness, accidents, fire, and crime were daily dangers. Yet some things were the same. Mothers still sang lullabies, warmed porridge for breakfast, and hoped their children might live to see adulthood. There were, of course, differences by class. A peasant mother might give birth in her own hut, surrounded by neighbors. A noblewoman might labor in a specially prepared birthing chamber, attended by servants and midwives. But once the child was born, both women faced many of the same fears: illness, instability, loss, and both would spend much of their lives ensuring their children survived not just infancy, but a childhood full of risk. Even the aristocracy was not immune to tragedy. The chronicles of noble households are filled with notes about children who died young. Some queens bore 10, 12, or even 15 children, only to see most of them die before reaching adulthood. Yet for all this loss, these mothers continued. They buried one child, then tried for another. They hosted feasts while quietly mourning. They performed public roles while carrying deep private grief. And this is perhaps the most unacknowledged feature of medieval motherhood: its repetition. Many women experienced cycles of pregnancy, birth, feeding, mourning, and work year after year. They did not have the luxury to stop or reflect. Children were not just loved, they were essential to household function, labor, and legacy. And so, motherhood was both sacred and strategic. Imagine a woman rising before dawn, nursing a baby on one arm while preparing bread with the other. Imagine her watching for signs of fever in a toddler while boiling herbs in a clay pot. Imagine her laying a child in a wooden cradle that has already held 6 of her children to living. For gone. She has no portrait, no letters in an archive, but she is as central to history as any king or warrior. Medieval motherhood wasn't an experience, it was a condition of life, one woven into the fabric of every social class, every village, every castle, every farm. And yet, for all the hardship, many mothers found joy in small victories: a baby's first steps, a daughter learning to sew, a son surviving a bout of illness. These moments weren't written down, but they were felt. And so we ask, what kept these women going, year after year, child after child, knowing that death was never far from the cradle? Was it faith? Was it duty? Or was it simply love, carried forward in silence? Time passes quickly in a medieval household. One moment, a mother is cradling an infant by firelight. The next, that same child is grown, leaving home to marry, take vows, or enter into trade. But while children moved on, a mother's role never truly ended. She remained the quiet fulcrum of the family, balancing custom, kinship, and memory. In a world governed by obligation and tradition, medieval motherhood stretched far beyond the cradle. For many women, the transition from active child-rearing to the role of matriarch was not clearly defined. There were no grand ceremonies to mark it, no birthdays, graduations, or retirement. Instead, it happened gradually. A daughter took over baking bread. A son took on the family trade. A younger woman became the one to nurse a child while the older mother stood by, offering advice whether it was wanted or not. But advice was one of the few tools she had left, with limited legal rights and social autonomy. Older women relied on influence, not authority. A mother's power in medieval society came not from her title, but from her relationships. She knew who married whom. She remembered debts. She held emotional sway over adult children, especially sons. She knew the unspoken history of the household, the things not written in charters, but etched in memory. Marriage was a critical arena for a mother's involvement, for noble families. Arranging a daughter's marriage was a matter of political strategy. For peasants, it was about securing labor and resources. In either case, mothers were deeply involved in matchmaking, even if the final decision technically rested with the father or the local lord. A woman who had raised several children became a kind of informal diplomat within her community, weighing personalities, dowries, and alliances. A wise match could elevate a family. A poor one could bring ruin. And yet, despite her efforts, a mother might find herself separated from her married daughters, once wed. A daughter often moved into her husband's household. Her loyalty, both legally and emotionally, was expected to transfer to her new family. For the mother left behind, this could be both a source of pride and quiet grief. She might rarely see her daughter again, especially if they lived in distant villages or had no means to travel. Letters were rare. Most of what passed between families was oral, and memory had to stand in for presence. Sons, too, could become distant. A boy who left to become a craftsman or a monk might not return for years, if at all. Yet many sons remained tied to their mothers in meaningful ways. A mother could serve as a confidant, especially in times of personal crisis. In rare surviving letters from the later Middle Ages, adult men write to their mothers with tenderness and reverence. One monk asked his mother to pray for his soul. Another thanked her for the bread and cheese she sent from home. These were small gestures, but they carried weight. Religious life, of course, remained central. Older mothers often devoted more time to prayer, pilgrimage, and spiritual reflection. If a woman had lost children through illness, childbirth, or war, she might dedicate herself more fully to the church. Some even joined religious orders as widows or aging matriarchs, becoming lay sisters who lived in convents but retained ties to their families. Widowhood was a major turning point in a mother's later life. For many women, it came early. The average life expectancy for men in physically demanding trades or peasant labor was not long. A woman widowed in her 40s or even 30s might be left with several children still under her care. Her life would change drastically. Without a husband, she could inherit some property but also carried new risks. She might remarry quickly or take on a greater role in managing household affairs. In some communities, widowed mothers had unexpected influence. They might act as heads of household, especially if their sons were not yet of age. They might appear in local courts to settle disputes or defend their family's land. In a few exceptional cases, they became respected figures in their village economies, brewing ale, midwifing, or running small businesses. Still, these opportunities were the exception. Most widowed mothers continued a quiet life of labor, devotion, and familial care. And what of old age? For the few who lived long enough to be considered elderly, motherhood transformed once again. An old woman in the Middle Ages was often viewed with suspicion but also respect. Folklore gave her many faces: the wise grandmother, the healer, the witch, and family life. She might serve as a storyteller, a babysitter, a moral compass. She might rock her daughter's baby to sleep using the same lullaby she once sang herself. Her wrinkles were maps of survival, her stories repositories of memory. Yet even in old age, motherhood could carry sorrow. Many women outlived multiple children, war, disease, famine. Each could sweep through a village and change a family tree overnight. One chronicler in 14th century England wrote about a woman who had buried 7 sons and lived on. Such endurance was common, though rarely recorded in detail. Grief was a constant companion, worn like a shawl. But so was resilience. Some older mothers found solace in the rising importance of legacy. If they could not control the fate of their children, they could at least pass on their values. This was often done through storytelling, tales of saints, of personal hardship, of moral lessons. A grandmother's voice by the hearth could shape a child's worldview more profoundly than any sermon. Legacy was also preserved in wills, though few women had the legal status to write one. When they did, they often listed small but meaningful items: a wooden spoon, a woolen gown, a string of prayer beads. These objects weren't grand heirlooms. They were tokens of use, of continuity. They told stories in the silence of inheritance. And perhaps this is the essence of medieval motherhood. It was rarely celebrated, but always foundational. These women cooked, cleaned, sewed, gave birth, buried, prayed, and taught without recognition, without monuments, yet the world continued because of them. When we imagine history, we often picture kings, battles, and cathedrals. But history also lived in the soft hands of a mother braiding her daughter's hair before a feast. It echoed, and the quiet blessing whispered over a feverish child. It pulsed in the rhythm of work, the songs of childhood, the rituals of daily survival. To be a mother in the Middle Ages was to live on the edge of uncertainty. You could not rely on medicine. You had little control over politics. Even the weather might turn against you. But within that narrow corridor of influence, you built something lasting: a family, a home, a fragile sense of meaning. And though the names of these mothers are mostly lost, buried under centuries of parchment and dust, their labor endures. It endures in the descendants who survived, in the cultures that preserved their wisdom, in the quiet ways that love and care defied time. So as the fire fades and the cradle rocks empty, we're left with a question not about what mothers did, but what they meant. When history forgets a woman, does her love vanish too? Or does it echo in the smallest rituals of life, long after her voice has fallen silent? You are not in a grand observatory, nor seated beneath a swirling galaxy of stars. You are in a narrow, cluttered shop somewhere in the Low Countries, surrounded by shelves of warped glass and the scent of soot. The table in front of you is littered with smudged lenses, copper rings, and hand-blown tubes. This place isn't the birthplace of astronomy, it's a place of tinkering. And the telescope, that revolutionary portal to the heavens, began not with cosmic ambition, but with blurred vision and the need to make out a ship on the horizon. Centuries before Galileo pointed anything at the stars, people had already begun to wonder how glass might bend light. But these were not scientists in the modern sense. They were artisans, glaziers, spectacle makers, people who cut, ground, and polished lenses for the practical needs of the nearsighted. It's here, in the hazy line between craft and curiosity, that the telescope was quietly born. To understand the slow and almost accidental path to the telescope, you must first understand medieval glass. Making glass in the early days was equal parts chemistry and superstition. Sand was melted with potash or soda ash and clumsy furnaces. The resulting blobs were blown, spun, or poured into shapes, and then ground down with stones or powders to the desired smoothness. Impurities were everywhere. A speck of iron could turn a lens green. A flicker in the flame could cause a bubble to form. Glass blowing was an art of tolerating imperfection, and yet this imperfection led, indirectly, to revelation. By the 13th century, monks and scholars were already experimenting with lenses to read manuscripts more easily. These were the so-called reading stones, rounded hunks of polished glass that, when placed over text, made the letters seem larger. The church, more interested in preserving knowledge than expanding it, found lenses useful for the aging eyes of scribes. By the late 1200s, the idea of spectacles, glasses worn on the face, emerged in Italy, particularly in Venice and Pisa. These early spectacles used convex lenses to help the farsighted read. Their invention is often credited, perhaps falsely, to a monk named Salvino Darmate, but in truth, no single person invented them. Like most things in the medieval world, glasses evolved slowly and collaboratively, passed from artisan to artisan with no patents, no scientific papers, only tools, trial, and trade secrets. Spectacle making spread northward over the next centuries, particularly to the Netherlands and Germany. These regions had the skilled artisans, the trade networks, and the curiosity to keep improving lens making. This is where we begin to approach the origins of the telescope, not in Florence or Rome, but in towns like Middelburg or Delft, small, damp cities where glassmakers and tinkers began fitting convex and concave lenses together, not for philosophy, but to sell to merchants who wanted to spot enemy ships sooner than their rivals. The story goes that around the year 1608, in the Dutch town of Middelburg, a spectacle maker named Hans Lippershey applied for a patent for a curious device. It was a tube, just a foot or so long, fitted with two lenses, one convex, one concave. When you looked through it, distant things appeared closer. Lippershey was not trying to start a scientific revolution. He was trying to win a government contract to make a tool for spotting armies. At a distance, his application was practical, commercial, and modest. What's more fascinating is that Lippershey wasn't the only one. Within months, at least two other Dutchmen, Jacob Metius and Zacharias Janssen, claimed they had created similar instruments. The fact that multiple people stumbled into the same invention at the same time tells us something important. The telescope wasn't a leap forward by one genius. It was an idea whose time had come, born from mundane needs, shared techniques, and quiet experimentation. What exactly did these early telescopes look like? Most were short tubes, perhaps 18 inches to 2 feet long, made of brass or wood at one end, a convex objective lens to gather light at the other, a concave eyepiece to focus it. They magnified objects, perhaps 3x or 4x, not much by modern standards, but enough to read a sign across a courtyard or see the mast of a ship before it reached harbor. The clarity wasn't perfect, edges blurred. The field of view was narrow, but it worked. The term telescope hadn't even been coined yet. That would come later, in Italy, from the Greek words telephorian, scoping, to look. But before that, the device went by clunky names like spyglass or Dutch perspective tube. It was a novelty, a toy for princes and generals, not yet a portal to the stars, which brings us, slowly, to Galileo Galilei. The Italian scientist didn't invent the telescope. What he did was hear about it, improve it, and point it skyward. In 1609, less than a year after Lippershey's patent application, Galileo constructed his own version of the device. Using hand-ground lenses, over the next few months, he produced models that magnified up to 20x, far beyond the Dutch prototypes. He didn't understand precisely how the lenses worked, no one really did yet, but he knew how to build them better. Still, before Galileo, there were others experimenting with telescopic tools. English mathematician Thomas Harriot, for example, drew the moon in July 1609, months before Galileo's famous lunar sketches. He used a simple Dutch spyglass and quietly made observations, never claiming much credit. Others across Europe were doing the same, craftsmen and thinkers pushing lenses further, improving clarity, increasing range. But most weren't writing treatises. They were simply building. And that's what makes the invention of the telescope so oddly boring and so profoundly human. It wasn't the result of a thunderbolt of genius. It was a dusty trail of glass, fragments, workshop gossip, and shipmen asking for better tools. It was made by people who didn't always know what they had made. What if the Dutch government had approved Lippershey's patent and kept the design secret? What if Galileo had never heard the rumor of the spyglass and focused solely on pendulums and inclined planes? What if a lens grinder in the back of a muddy shop had sneezed and chipped the critical edge of a prototype? Would we have waited decades more to glimpse the moons of Jupiter? As you sit in the imaginary glow of a late 16th century workshop, glass shavings on your hands, you can almost hear the dull scrape of lens against stone. You can smell the furnace. You can feel how accidental it all was. The telescope, that instrument of science and stargazing, began not with Newton or Kepler, but with traders, glaziers, and tinkers. Not with questions about the universe, but about who was approaching on the road and whether you could read a sign across the market square. So many things we think of as grand had such ordinary beginnings, and yet, at what point does a tool become a telescope? Is it when someone peers through it and sees the moon? Or is it in the moment a bored apprentice screws two mismatched lenses into a tube, just to see what happens? You are in Padua now. It's the year 1609, and the stones beneath your feet are still warm from the afternoon sun. In the upper floors of a modest building not far from the university, a man stands beside a workbench, turning a wooden tube in his hands. Outside, the city buzzes with carts, sermons, and the clink of wine glasses. But here in this workshop, the air is different. It's tense, intent. Something has changed. Galileo Galilei, professor of mathematics, engineer, and occasional troublemaker, is adjusting the last screw on what he calls his canoni occhiali, his optical cannon. It is, simply, a telescope, but not the kind that anyone else in Italy has seen. This one, built through countless hours of lens grinding and adjustment, can magnify 20 times. That means a ship on the Venetian lagoon, visible to the naked eye, only as a faint dot, appears close enough to read its flag. He didn't invent the telescope. He is well aware of that. But he has made it better, much better. And more importantly, he knows what to do with it. The story often skips this part. It jumps from invention to inspiration, as if Galileo immediately turned the telescope to the stars. But he didn't. His first impulse, like the Dutch makers before him, was practical. He offered his device to the Venetian government as a militar tool, useful for spotting enemy vessels or surveying distant hills. The Senate was impressed. They doubled his salary and confirmed his lifelong tenure at the university. The idea that this spyglass might have celestial use came only gradually, and almost accidentally. At some point, we don't know exactly when, Galileo turned the telescope upward. What he saw unsettled everything. First came the moon. With the naked eye, the moon appears smooth, perfect, and pale. But through Galileo's telescope, it was pocked with craters, scarred with shadows, ridged with mountains. This was no perfect celestial sphere, as Aristotle had taught for centuries. It looked earthly, imperfect, touched by time. Then came Jupiter. On the night of January 7, 1610, Galileo noticed something strange. 3 bright points near the planet that seemed to shift position each night. A fourth appeared days later. These weren't stars. They were moons, 4 of them orbiting Jupiter in defiance of every accepted belief about the heavens. Planets weren't supposed to have moons. Only Earth did. And everything, the church insisted, orbited Earth. Next came the phases of Venus, the strange years of Saturn, and the countless stars that spilled from the Milky Way. One by one, the heavens cracked open under the lens of a modest wooden tube. Galileo didn't keep this to himself. In fact, he rushed to publish. In March 1610, he released Sidereus Nuncius the Starry Messenger, a short booklet filled with his observations. It was part science, part self-promotion, and entirely revolutionary. The book didn't just describe what he had seen, it named his telescope the instrument of that seeing. Galileo was not merely an observer, he was a herald of a new age. And yet, not everyone was thrilled. The Catholic Church, long the gatekeeper of celestial order, found these claims troubling. If the moon was flawed, if Jupiter had moons, if Venus changed phases like the moon, then maybe the Earth wasn't the center of it all. Maybe the geocentric model, the cornerstone of theological astronomy, was wrong. Galileo knew this. But at first, he tried to play a careful game. He offered his telescope to cardinals and scholars. He invited them to look for themselves. Some did. Many saw exactly what he described, but others didn't or claimed not to. A few declared the instrument flawed. Others accused him of trickery. Telescopes, after all, distorted reality. They were not to be trusted as divine instruments. This is one of the quieter tragedies of the telescope's invention. For every eye that widened in wonder, another squinted in disbelief. The very tool that made the universe more visible also made truth more complicated. Still, Galileo pressed on. In 1611, he traveled to Rome and was welcomed by some of the city's intellectual elite. Jesuit astronomers confirmed many of his findings. For a while, it seemed the telescope might earn its place in the hierarchy of accepted tools, perhaps even displace the old models. But the church was slow to commit. Questions about heliocentrism, raised by Copernicus decades earlier, began to resurface. Galileo's observations supported this dangerous idea that the Earth moved around the sun, that God's creation was not fixed but spinning. In 1616, the Inquisition issued a warning. Heliocentrism was declared formally heretical, and Galileo was told not to teach or promote it. He agreed, reluctantly, and withdrew from direct public defense. For a time, the telescope became quiet again, but the seed had been planted. While Galileo's struggles with the church would reach a dramatic climax years later, the more mundane story is that telescopes began to spread across Europe. Craftsmen in Italy, England, and Germany began producing their own versions. Some followed Galileo's designs. Others experimented. The improvements came steadily. Longer tubes, better lenses, more precise mounts. By the 1620s, telescopes with 30x or 40x magnification were not uncommon, but they were still crude by modern standards. Chromatic aberration, the colored halos around bright objects, remained a constant annoyance. Glass purity was unpredictable. Tubes bent, eyepieces fogged. The men who built these telescopes were not always astronomers. Many were tradesmen, lens grinders, mirror polishers, cabinet makers. A few, like the Dutchman Christian Huygens, were both scientists and artisans. Huygens would eventually invent the first accurate pendulum clock, but in the 1650s, he turned his attention skyward. Using a telescope he built himself, he discovered Titan, Saturn's largest moon. He saw the rings of Saturn more clearly than Galileo ever had, and he did this not in an observatory, but in the quiet of his own home. It's worth pausing here, because even as the telescope revolutionized astronomy, most of its early users were not professionals. There were no tenured astrophysicists, no satellite feeds. There were simply curious people with steady hands and enough patience to grind a lens to just the right curve. And that was no small task. To make a good lens in the 17th century, you needed glass of consistent clarity, a hard grinding surface, a fine abrasive, often emery or rouge, and an almost meditative focus. You had to press and rotate, sometimes for hours. or days, until the surface matched a desired curvature, to shallow, and the image would blur, to deep, and the light would scatter. It was a tactile, intimate craft, part engineering, part endurance test. The stakes were common. A fleck of grit could ruin a lens. A sudden change in temperature could warp a tube. Sometimes, a promising telescope became useless because of glue, joint weakened, or a mirror cracked. And yet, they kept trying. Not because of fame or fortune, few of these makers would be remembered, but because the promise of seeing what others could not was too strong to resist. Galileo, meanwhile, continued to improve his telescopes, despite mounting pressure from critics. He made a version with 30x magnification and turned it to the sun using darkened glass to observe sunspots. This, too, was controversial. The sun was supposed to be pure and unblemished, but Galileo saw black smudges crawling across its face. He argued, correctly, that the sun rotated, and these were surface features, not stars in the foreground. As some insisted, his writings on sunspots sparked heated debate with fellow astronomers, most notably Christoph Scheiner, a Jesuit who accused Galileo of arrogance and heresy. The telescope, once a neutral tool, had become a political weapon. What it revealed could not be unseen, but it could be denied. And so the telescope hovered in a strange space between wonder and suspicion. It offered clarity, but threatened certainty. It revealed truth, but undermined authority. Imagine, now, the delicate sound of grinding wheels in a backroom workshop, the gentle rasp of glass being shaped, the pause to hold it to the light, squint, adjust, and return to work. This is how the telescope spread, not through grand declarations, but through countless small acts of curiosity, through apprentices and journeymen, through hours spent perfecting a curve few would understand. It is often said that the telescope changed humanity's place in the universe, but the quieter truth is that it changed how we looked, not just what we saw, but how we chose to observe. It made the eye an instrument. It made distance measurable. It made secrets visible. But even as Galileo's discoveries gained attention, the question lingered: could one truly trust what was seen through such a device? If the telescope revealed imperfection in the heavens, what did that say about perfection itself? You are now in late 17th century England. The air smells of soot, parchment, and damp wool. The telescope has aged a little longer, leaner, and slightly more dignified. It's no longer the curious toy it once was. It's a tool of statecraft, of science, of serious thought, in the countryside near Cambridge. A quiet man with sharp eyes and wild ideas sits beneath the thatched roof of his workshop, tinkering with lenses. His name is Isaac Newton. Not by now. Galileo is dead. The church has silenced him. Though his observations continue to ripple across Europe, his telescope, that modest tube of wood and glass, has become a fixture among natural philosophers. But it has flaws, noticeable ones. Chromatic aberration, in particular, bothers Newton. The colors won't stay still. Bright objects blur at the edges, as if rainbows are trying to escape the image. Newton does something no one else had the audacity or stubbornness to attempt. He redesigns the telescope entirely. Instead of using glass lenses, Newton turns to mirrors. He builds the first reflecting telescope in 1668, a compact, elegant device that uses a curved metal mirror to gather and focus light. No colored fringes. No need for huge lengths of tubing. The image is clearer, sharper, purer. He keeps it small, barely 6 inches long, and shows it to the Royal Society in London. The scholars are impressed. One of them even recommends awarding Newton a medal, which he politely declines. This is the first major fork in telescope history. From here on, topophs diverge. Refractors, which use lenses, and reflectors, which use mirrors. Both will evolve over time, and both will
have their champions. But Newton's little scope opens the door to a new kind of astronomy, one that doesn't rely on human eyesight alone. Still, the progress remains slow. These instruments are fragile. The mirrors must be polished constantly. The lenses fog in winter. The mountings wobble. For every great astronomer peering into the heavens, there's an unsung craftsman in the background. Someone who's spent months perfecting a single curve or shaving a tiny missile, IGN-MENT, dot in Germany. Johannes Havalius continues building massive telescopes in the attic of his house. His wife, Elizabeth, assists him. She becomes one of the first women in Europe to publish astronomical observations under her own name. In France, Giovanni de Cassini uses his telescope to chart the moons of Saturn. He identifies the division in Saturn's rings that now bears his name, the Cassini division. The discoveries are accumulating, not just moons and rings, but mountains on Mars, nebulas, and binary stars. In the early 18th century, in the town of Bath, a musician turned astronomer named William Herschel begins grinding mirrors in his spare time. He starts with modest instruments, but his ambition grows. Eventually, he builds a telescope 40 feet long with a mirror nearly 4 feet wide, the largest of its kind at the time. It's so big it needs a scaffold to operate, and so powerful it reveals something astonishing. Uranus, a new planet, the first ever discovered by telescope. This is a turning point. Until now, planets were fixed. The ancients had counted them all, but the telescope has found something no naked eye ever saw. The solar system isn't complete, it's larger, stranger, and more populated than anyone suspected. Herschel doesn't stop there. He catalogues thousands of stars and nebulae. He theorizes, correctly, that the Milky Way is a flattened disk. He even suggests that some nebulae may be entire galaxies, island universes, far beyond our own. His sister, Caroline Herschel, becomes an accomplished astronomer in her own right, discovering 8 comets and working tirelessly to index stars. But while the heavens expand, life on Earth remains oddly unchanged for the telescope makers themselves. Many are still working in sheds and back rooms. The process of making a good mirror or lens is still intimate, still difficult, still almost entirely by hand. Through the 19th century, observatories become more formal. Large refracting telescopes, like the 40-inch Yerkes refractor in Wisconsin, are built as monuments to human curiosity. Their domes gleam in the sunlight. Their gears are machined with industrial precision. But the men who operate them still climb wooden ladders. They still peer through narrow eyepieces. Observing the stars is still, in many ways, a solitary task. And then, almost silently, the camera enters. In the mid-1800s, photography finds its way to astronomy. It is a subtle revolution. Before this, an astronomer had to sketch what they saw, an imprecise, subjective task. Now, the telescope can record. It can capture stars invisible to the human eye. It can prove what was once only hinted at. It can keep seeing long after the observer is gone.
By the early 20th century, glass photographic plates allow astronomers to see deep into space. The Harvard Observatory employs women known as computers to catalog the stars in these plates. Among them Annie Jumpcannon and Henrietta Swan Leavitt, who will quietly transform astronomy through their meticulous work. Leavitt discovers the relationship between a star's brightness and its periodicity, laying the groundwork for measuring distances in space. Meanwhile, telescope design accelerates. In 1917, the 100-inch Hooker telescope is completed on Mount Wilson in California. It is with this telescope that Edwin Hubble confirms the Andromeda Nebula is, in fact, another galaxy entirely, and that our own galaxy is not the universe's center. The cosmos is not just vast, it is expanding. We've come a long way from that first Dutch spyglass. And yet, even as the telescope grows, so does its detachment from the human eye. Astronomers begin sitting in control rooms rather than outdoors. Computers handle positioning. Data is gathered in wavelengths we can't even perceive. Radio, infrared, ultraviolet, X-ray. In 1990, the Hubble Space Telescope is launched into orbit. Its mirror is only to point for meters across, but from above Earth's atmosphere, it sees more clearly than any ground-based telescope ever could. Its images redefine what a telescope even is. You don't look through it, it sends pictures to your screen. The idea of the lone stargazer is replaced by teams of engineers and astronomers, interpreting streams of data from machines 300 miles above the planet. Hubble reveals that the universe is 13.8 billion years old. It shows us star nurseries in the Eagle Nebula, distant galaxies colliding, and the earliest light from just after the Big Bang. The device Galileo once held in his hands has now pierced the veil of time. But perhaps the quietest wonder of all is the James Webb Space Telescope, launched in 2021. It doesn't even use visible light. It sees an infrared. Its segmented mirror, gold-coated and 6.5 meters wide, unfolds in space like a mechanical flower. And it sees things no telescope has ever seen. Exoplanets with chemical signatures in their atmospheres. Ancient galaxies glowing with the heat of birth. And yet, here we are, in a dim room, remembering a man in the 1600s who stared at the moon and noticed its roughness. A man who had no inkling of galaxies or expansion, but who dared to look. A man whose hands shook slightly as he adjusted his first wooden scope, and who could not have imagined that his creation would one day float above the clouds, whispering the secrets of the cosmos in digital language. So what do we make of it all? That a toy sold in a Dutch shop could birth a new way of seeing. That an amateur's curiosity could unravel centuries of assumption. That the universe was always there, silent, waiting, but it took a small tube of glass and wood to make. US realized how little we knew. And even now, as telescopes peer into quasars and dark matter, the question lingers: are we seeing everything? Or are there still things just beyond our current instruments that remain hidden? A fainter planet, a deeper structure, a truth we're not yet equipped to observe. What lighting a room was like before electricity, or in a quiet room, one without light switches, without bulbs, without even a match. It is evening and the sun has gone down, but your work is not finished. Perhaps you are sewing, perhaps you are writing, or maybe you are just trying to find your shoes without stubbing your toe. Either way, it's too dark to see. And so, like countless generations before the 19th century, you must ask yourself the same daily question: how will I make light before electricity? Artificial lighting wasn't just a convenience, it was a daily labor, a small battle against the natural darkness that reclaims the world every night. In ancient times, people didn't take light for granted. They planned for it, rationed it, and sometimes feared it. Because while the day was defined by the sun, the night belonged to fire, oil, tallow, and the patience of whoever was responsible for tending the flame. Let's start far back, before cities, before temples, before writing. Picture a cave-in, Paleolithic Europe, around 20,000 years ago. A group of humans huddle inside, the stone walls faintly illuminated by the flickering flame of a small stone lamp. This lamp is crude but effective, a shallow dish carved from limestone, filled with animal fat, and holding a twisted bit of moss or dried fiber is a wick. It doesn't burn brightly, it doesn't last long, but it gives just enough light to paint animals on the walls or prepare a hide for clothing. This is one of the earliest known forms of indoor lighting. Not a bonfire, not a torch, but a lamp, something small, personal, and portable. And it already tells us something important. Light, in the past, was always precious. Now, let's move ahead to ancient Mesopotamia. The people of Sumer, living in the flatlands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. also used small oil lamps. They shaped them from clay, some open like a shallow bowl, others with a closed spout to control the flame. These lamps burned sesame oil if you were lucky, or animal fats if you were poor. Light came at a cost. Oil had to be pressed, rendered, stored. Wicks had to be twisted from flax or wool or papyrus. A lamp might burn for a few hours, and then it was out. People would often ration light the same way they ration grain or water. In the homes of ordinary families, there might be just one lamp for the entire household. It would be set near the hearth or on a small niche in the wall. It wasn't enough to brighten the room. It was enough to not trip over the dog dot in larger cities like Babylon. There were public lamps too, especially in temples or important government buildings. These lamps were more ornate, made of bronze or stone, sometimes with inscriptions. But they served the same humble purpose, punctuating the dark with a little spot of flame. By the time we reach ancient Egypt, lighting has become a bit more refined. Wealthy Egyptians used stone and bronze oil lamps, often shaped like lotus. Flowers or small animals, they might burn castor oil or even perfumed oils, which smelled better but burned quickly. For the poor, simple clay lamps or bundles of burning reeds did the job. One intriguing detail from Egyptian homes is the use of lampstands, tall, narrow holders that raise the light source higher in the room. This made a single lamp more effective. Though still dim by modern standards, the shadows flickered, the ceilings blackened with soot. But for scribes working late, or women grinding grain in the evening, it was enough. We often think of the ancient Greeks and Romans as more advanced, and in many ways they were. But lighting remained a slow and efficient business. Greek households used terracotta lamps with a spout and handle. The wick sat inside the spout, drawing oil from the reservoir. These lamps were cheap and easy to produce. Archaeologists have found thousands of them, some decorated with scenes of mythology or everyday life. Roman lamps were similar, but sometimes featured multiple spouts to produce several flames at once. But more flames meant more oil burn, more smoke released, and more refilling required. In a Roman villa, oil lamps would be set along the walls or held in metal sconces. Some could be carried with handles. A wealthy Roman might even have a servant whose job was to maintain and refill the lamps each night, part of a household staff focused on nothing more glamorous than making sure you didn't walk into a pillar in the dark. And yet, even in Rome, most people still follow the sun. They rose early and went to bed shortly after nightfall. Artificial light was too expensive to waste. The streets of ancient cities were mostly unlit. If you were out after dark, you carried a lantern or hoped the moon was full. In some towns, laws forbade movement after sundown unless you were on official business. Night belonged to thieves, wild dogs, and missteps. But the idea of using flame for light didn't stop evolving. By the early medieval period in Europe, lighting had taken on a distinctly religious tone. In monasteries, candles were used during prayer, often made of beeswax and molded with care. Unlike animal fat tallow candles, which smelled awful and burned with a smoky flame, beeswax candles burned cleanly and were considered pure. As such, they were reserved for the altar, the chapel, and high-ranking clergy in most homes. Tallow candles were the only affordable option, messy, soft, and quick to melt. Candles themselves were a craft. Tallow had to be boiled and rendered. Wicks had to be dipped repeatedly, sometimes dozens of times, to build up a usable candle. Candle making was a full-time trade, and in medieval towns, chandlers' candle makers set up shops near markets and churches. You could buy candles by the weight or by the bundle, and if you were poor, you might simply light a rushlight, a thin stalk of dried rush, a marsh plant dipped in animal fat. It burned fast and low, just enough to get you from one room to another before the flame disappeared. In the Islamic world, lighting developed along its own arc. From the Grand Mosque of Baghdad to the palaces of Cordoba, oil lamps were often works of art. Hanging glass lamps inscribed with verses from the Quran became a hallmark of Islamic architecture. These lamps burned olive oil and were suspended in clusters from high ceilings, casting a soft, sacred glow over marble floors. In more practical settings, simple pottery lamps served households much like they did in Europe or Asia. Light was both functional and spiritual, and often symbolic used during rituals, festivals, or to mark the hours of the night in religious observance. China, too, had its own traditions. Oil lamps were common in early dynasties, made of bronze, porcelain, or clay. Some had lids or chimneys to control smoke. Lanterns made of silk or paper were also used, especially during festivals. The Chinese also invented the first known candles, made from whale fat as early as the Han Dynasty. Lighting was as much about beauty as it was about practicality. The soft glow of a silk-covered lantern was prized not for its brightness, but for the calm ambience it brought to a room. By the time we enter the Renaissance in Europe, lighting is still dim, expensive, and labor-intensive. Chandeliers hung in castles, but only the wealthiest could afford to fill them with candles. Often they were lowered with pulleys, lit, and then hoisted back up. Wall-mounted candle holders became more common, and large families assigned the chore of candle making to servants or children. Light remained limited to a few rooms of a home. Bedrooms were usually dark. Kitchens, ironically, were better lit since the hearth fire was usually still going. There were no matches, no lighters. To relight a candle, you needed fire either from the hearth, a flint tan steel spark, or a live ember preserved overnight. In many homes, the fire was never allowed to go out entirely. If it did, someone had to visit a neighbor to borrow a hot coal or a burning taper. Fire was a shared resource, almost communal. And what about the streets? Some cities began experimenting with public lighting in the 17th century. Paris, in particular, installed oil lamps on street corners as early as the 1660s. These were filled by hand each evening and lit with long tapers by lamplighters. It was a slow, methodical process. In London, too, oil lamps began to appear in busier districts. But most rural towns remained dark, and most people still avoided traveling at night unless absolutely necessary. So, in all these centuries, lighting remained a daily task, something to prepare for, maintain, and respect. A luxury for some, a burden for others, and a symbol of control over one of nature's most constant forces, the night. And still, the most pressing question lingered across generations. In every culture and every household, night after night, how long can this last? You awaken just before dawn. In a world where the sun remains the ultimate alarm clock, the room is dark and quiet. The fire in the hearth has died down to embers, and the only thing keeping you from tripping over the stool on your way to the chamber pot is a stub of tallow candle, flickering weakly in a small iron holder by the bed. If it's your job to tend the candles, or if you're a servant in a wealthy household, your day starts with darkness, and it will end in darkness too. Long after the rest of the household has gone to bed, when you extinguish the final light. In this world before electricity, there's an entire ecosystem built around lighting, a world of chandlers and lamplighters, of soot-scraped ceilings and windowless interiors. Every bit of light is accounted for, rationed, and worked for. It's not just a convenience, it's labor, and it tells us a great deal about how daily life functioned for centuries in homes, cities, and institutions across Europe, Asia, and beyond. Let's return for a moment to the candle, the simple, stubby pillar that became a symbol of domestic light. In the medieval period, the quality of candles varied wildly. The wealthiest might afford beeswax, with its sweet scent and smokeless glow. But beeswax was rare, expensive, and labor-intensive to produce. Entire hives had to be sacrificed, and beekeeping required careful management. Beeswax was often reserved for religious ceremonies, royal courts, and the homes of nobility. Everyone else used tallow, animal fat rendered from cows, sheep, or pigs. These candles were soft, greasy, and had a strong odor when burned. They smoked, they sputtered, and they had to be kept cool or they bend and melt before they were lit. Tallow candle making was not for the faint of heart. Chandlers boiled fat in great cauldrons, sometimes mixed with lye or salt to purify it. The process was smelly and hazardous, and chandlers were often located on the outskirts of town because of the stench. Wicks were dipped over and over again into vats of melted fat, then cooled, then dipped again. It could take 20 or 30 dips to build a candle of usable size. Some chandlers offered molds to speed up the process, but many candles were still hand-dipped, slow and imperfect. A finished candle didn't last long. One candle might burn for 4 to 6 hours, depending on its size and quality. In a household trying to stretch its candle budget, you didn't just light them freely. You used them one at a time. You trimmed the wick carefully to avoid soot, and when the flame guttered low, you snuffed it out with a bell-shaped snuffer. To preserve the stub, some people reused leftover bits of candle wax to form new candles, scraping soot and dirt from the remains before remelting them. Others stored used stubs in candle boxes to be melted down later. In especially frugal homes, candles were lit only in the evening, and even then, only when absolutely needed. In castles and manor houses, lighting took on an architectural scale. Chandeliers, large wooden or iron frames fitted with dozens of candles hung from great halls. They were heavy, soot-covered, and required pulleys to lower and raise them. Lighting a chandelier was a time-consuming task. Servants climbed ladders or used taper poles, long sticks with a lit candle on the end to ignite each candle, one by one. Then they had to monitor them throughout the evening, snuffing and replacing them as needed. So was a constant problem. Ceilings blackened, walls yellowed, people coughed. Rooms were rarely lit for beauty. They were lit for necessity. And even then, only as much as your resources allowed. Some of the cleverest lighting innovations came not from materials but from placement. Mirrors, polished metal reflectors, and glass panes were used to magnify and redirect the glow. In wealthier homes, wall sconces with curved backs helped spread the candle's reach. In some 18th century European homes, glass bell jars were placed over candles not to extinguish them, but to stabilize the flame and reduce smoke while also reflecting the light downward. But lighting a room wasn't just about equipment, it was about people. Let's talk about the lamplighter. In many pre-electric cities, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries, public lighting slowly began to emerge. Paris was among the first to systematically light its streets. Beginning in the 1660s, street lamps were placed at intersections and key roads, hung on ropes stretched between buildings or mounted on posts. Each evening, a city-employed lamplighter would walk the routes, carrying a long pole with a lit taper at one end. He would touch the flame to the wick, then move to the next lamp. In the morning, he came again to extinguish the lamps, clean the glass, and refill the oil. A single lamplighter might be responsible for hundreds of lights. Other cities followed suit. In London, after the Great Fire of 1666, the need for public lighting became even clearer. Oil lamps were installed in wealthier neighborhoods and shopping districts. Glass-covered lanterns with curved lenses became standard. In the winter, when the sun set early, lamplighters began their work in the mid-afternoon. Some were mocked or viewed as meddling bureaucrats. Others were beloved neighborhood fixtures. Walking the same routes year after year with slow, methodical care. Eventually, the lamplighter became a symbol of the city itself, a figure who brought order and safety to the urban night. But make no mistake, lamplighting was hard work. It required precision, patience, and a tolerance for weather. Rain and wind could extinguish your efforts in moments. Oil could spill. Flames could get to high and crack the glass. Every night was an exercise in maintenance, and the oil itself, that was an entire supply chain. Whale oil was prized in the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly in New England and the Netherlands. It burned cleaner and brighter than most plant oils, and as whaling expanded, So did the availability of whale oil for lamps. But it was expensive and ethically grim. Olive oil remained common around the Mediterranean, while in colder climates, people relied on lard, butter, and even fish oil. Each type of oil burned differently. Whale oil gave a brighter light, but had a distinct odor. Olive oil burned slowly, but required careful wicking. Tallow burned fast, dirty, and cheap. The kind of oil you used told others something about your status, your geography, and even your religion, since certain oils were forbidden or avoided in specific traditions. Let's not forget the lantern, either. While torches and open flame, lamps had their place. Lanterns were vital for mobility. A lantern might be made of metal, with horn or glass panes, and a small candle or oil lamp inside. They were carried on hooks or poles, or hung from carts, boats, and saddles. Lanterns were also used in lighthouses, some of which, like the Great Lighthouse of Alexandria, used massive fire-based systems to warn ships. For travelers, a good lantern was essential. In the Middle Ages, roads were poorly lit if at all, and full of hazards. Lanterns provided a cone of flickering light just large enough to spot holes, mud, or bandits. In towns, watchmen carried them as they patrolled. Churches and monasteries hung them in doorways and cloisters. Even the dead sometimes carried light. Funeral processions were lit by handheld lanterns to guide the soul. But even indoors, lanterns had their place. Some were mounted on swiveling arms, allowing them to be pulled close for reading or pushed away to light a larger space. Others were fixed in wooden frames and hung from beams. Like everything in pre-electric lighting, lanterns required care. The oil had to be refilled, the wicks trimmed, the glass cleaned. Every day, every night. And so we find ourselves surrounded not just by tools of light, but by a quiet, persistent culture of tending, adjusting, preserving. Illumination was an act, not a switch. Whether you were a monk waking before matins to light the altar candles, or a London lamplighter trudging through the rain with a taper and a rag, the job of keeping the world visible after dark was a full-time concern. What's most fascinating is how the rhythms of life were shaped around this fragile technology. The phrase "burning the midnight oil" wasn't just poetic, it was practical. Oil and candles cost money. If you were up late working or studying, it meant something. It meant extra effort. It meant extra light. And that, in turn, meant someone had to provide it. Before the invention of electricity, the night was not your ally. It was a boundary. You didn't simply flip a switch and keep working. You stopped. You waited. You planned around the hours of light. And if you broke that pattern, someone, whether servant or priest or chandler, had to pay the price in oil, wax, and weary hands. So what changed? How did the flicker of flame give way to the steady hum of electric current? And what was lost when the night finally became as bright as day? By the mid-18th century, the world had begun to flirt with a different kind of flame, one born not from oil, wax, or animal fat, but from gas. And though it would be decades before this invention reached everyday homes, it marked the beginning of a slow but sweeping transformation in how humanity experienced the dark. Let's begin, as so many lighting innovations do, in the urban shadows. Coal, gas known at first simply as manufactured gas, emerged from the coke ovens of industrializing England. When coal was heated in the absence of oxygen, it didn't just produce coke for steelmaking. It also released a flammable gas mixture that, when trapped and piped, could be burned in lamps. The glow was steady, brighter than most candles, and gave off a characteristic flickering blue-orange flame. But its early adoption was more experimental than elegant. In 1792, a British engineer named William Murdoch became one of the first to use coal gas to light his own home in Redruth, Cornwall. Murdoch had been tinkering with gas pipes and burners, slowly transforming his dim rooms into eerily bright ones. His work caught the attention of the Boulton and Watt Steam Engine Company, where he was employed, and by 1802, They were demonstrating the use of gas lighting on a larger scale. That same year, Murdoch famously lit the exterior of the Soho foundry with gas, astonishing onlookers who had never seen such brightness after sunset. By 1807, Pall Mall in London became the first street in the world lit by gaslight. The transformation was immediate and profound. People began to linger outdoors at night. Shopkeepers stayed open later. The city began to develop what we might call an evening personality, an extension of the day, instead of a retreat into candlelit interiors. But this shift was far from simple. Gaslight required infrastructure, not just the lamps themselves, but entire networks of gasworks, pressurized pipes, valves, meters, and trained technicians to monitor flow and pressure. Early gas systems were prone to leaks, fires, and even explosions. The gas had a distinctive odor, initially from impurities and later intentionally added as a safety measure. It blackened ceilings, stained walls, and gave people headaches. But it was cheaper and brighter than oil, and the appetite for more light outweighed the discomfort. Inside homes, gas was initially confined to hallways, stairwells, and kitchens. It wasn't always trusted in bedrooms, where the risk of leaks, while sleeping posed a danger. Gaslight chandeliers and sconces were installed in wealthier homes, with elegant brass fixtures and etched glass globes designed to diffuse the harsh flame. In public buildings, theaters, train stations, and factories, gas became standard. Cities across Europe and North America built municipal gasworks to keep the flames fed. In the 1820s and 1830s, even small towns began to convert. Lamplighters didn't disappear, but their jobs changed. Now they carried ignition torches and keys to valves, lighting and regulating gas lamps at dusk and extinguishing them again at dawn. In winter, the contrast between the warm yellow glow of gaslight and the cold night air became a kind of spectacle in itself. The light was artificial, yes, but it was also enchanting, dreamy, even romantic. Poets and painters of the 19th century often described the gaslight streets as mysterious and half magical. It was an age of contrast, a world in transition between flickering past and glowing future. But every light cast a new kind of shadow. With artificial lighting more available, the structure of the human day began to shift. Previously, most people lived by the sun's timetable, working during daylight, eating before dusk, and sleeping early. Candles or oil lamps extended the evening slightly, but not substantially. Gaslight made it possible to read at midnight, to dine well into the night, or to work in a textile mill long after the sun had set. Factories could run double shifts. The workday lengthened. Cities never quite went dark. This new control over night hours wasn't universally celebrated. Some worried that gaslight disturbed natural rhythms and sleep patterns. Others pointed to the filth gas lamps release carbon dioxide, soot, and noxious fumes. And while brighter than candles, they were still dim by modern standards. In homes, you still had to position yourself strategically to read or sew. Light remained a precious commodity, even if it no longer smelled like tallow. Then, in the mid-19th century, a young American inventor named Thomas Edison began experimenting with filaments. Edison wasn't the first to explore electric lighting. Dozens of inventors in Britain, France, and the US had tinkered with electric arc lamps throughout the 1830s and 1840s. Arc lamps, which used a spark between two carbon rods, were blindingly bright but noisy, short-lived, and dangerous. They were used to light public squares and train stations, but were unsuitable for homes. What Edison did in 1879 was to create a practical, long-lasting incandescent bulb, using a carbonized bamboo filament and a vacuum-sealed glass bulb. He developed a light that could glow for over 1,000 hours without scorching the room or requiring daily tending. His early electric lights were soft, reliable, and most importantly controllable. The electric bulb, paired with a wall switch, represented the final revolution in domestic lighting. For For the first time in human history, you could enter a room and simply flip light into existence. No wick, no oil, no matches, no smoke, just current. At first, electricity was a novelty. It arrived in the homes of the wealthy and powerful Vanderbilt, mansions, elite hotels, and urban banks. But as electric grids expanded through the 1880s and 1890s, more middle-class homes were wired. Cities installed street lamps powered by dynamos. Factories switched from gas to electric motors. Electric lighting spread rapidly, and with it, a profound shift in how people conceived of time, space, and labor. You no longer had to plan your activities around the sun or your candle budget. You no longer needed to ration light, trim wicks, or worry about drafts extinguishing your flame. The cost of staying awake and productive after dark plummeted. Offices extended hours. Cafes stayed open later. The concept of nightlife exploded. By 1900, the gas lamp was in decline. Many cities dismantled their gas light networks entirely by the 1920s, while rural electrification came more slowly. In places where electricity remained too expensive or unavailable, kerosene lamps and gaslight lingered, but increasingly as symbols of the past. What once represented modernity now became quaint. The psychological effect of the electric switch was quiet but profound. Where once lighting a room had been an active decision, a moment requiring thought, fuel, and sometimes a second person, it was now passive, instantaneous. You could forget the light as soon as you had it, and perhaps something was lost in that. Forgetting. We lost the shared rituals of lighting, of the lamplighter's footsteps on cobblestone, of mothers trimming wicks, of children watching shadows dance on the ceiling. We lost the quiet awareness of flame, the scent of beeswax, the soot that reminded you of warmth and time. We stopped thinking of light as a labor and started thinking of it as a right. But in some corners of the world, the old rhythms still whisper. A hurricane knocks out power, and we fumble for candles. A campsite goes dark, and we gather around a lantern. Even now, we associate flickering light with safety, memory, and intimacy. It's no accident that we decorate holidays with candles, or that electric lamps try so hard to mimic the color of fire. The history of lighting, then, is not just a story of technology. It's a story of how humans shaped and reshaped their lives around something as ephemeral as a flame, of how we bent the night to our needs, one innovation at a time. From olive oil lamps in ancient Greece to chandeliers in Versailles, from whale oil streetlights in Boston to Edison bulbs in Brooklyn. It was never just about brightness. It was about control, about comfort, about how long you could work, how far you could walk, or whether you could read just one more page before bed. And now, here you are reading or listening in a room that may be filled with soft, steady light, a room lit not by wax, not by flame, but by electrons flowing invisibly through copper wires in your walls. There's no smoke, no smell, just quiet illumination. And yet, somewhere deep inside, your brain still responds to the fading of the day, still waits for darkness, still carries the memory of fire. So the next time you flip a switch without thinking, what other quiet rituals have we left behind? In the dark, what medieval schools were actually like you were in a schoolroom in the early 13th century? It smells of damp stone, ink, and damp old cloaks. The floors are uneven, the walls cold even in spring, and the only heat in the room radiates from a hearth that may or may not be lit, depending on the generosity of the church or the wealth of the town. There are no desks, no paper, no colored chalk or illustrations, and certainly no windows designed to let in sunlight, only narrow slits that serve as architectural afterthoughts, reluctantly admitting the light. This is what a medieval school looks like, and if you're here, you're very lucky, you're very unfortunate, depending on how you feel about Latin wooden paddles, and the terrifying possibility of being publicly corrected for a grammatical error involving the ablative case. For most of the Middle Ages, education in Europe was a luxury tightly bound to the church. If you were to receive any kind of formal instruction, It would almost certainly be under the supervision of a priest or monk, often inside or beside a cathedral. These were the cathedral schools' ancient predecessors of our modern institutions, and they existed primarily to train future clergy. That meant the curriculum was focused on scripture, the church fathers, and the arcane art of Latin grammar. Students might range in age from 6 to 16. In some cases, young boys would be sent to live at the school from the time they could speak, apprenticing in literacy like a tradesman might apprentice in blacksmithing. Girls, meanwhile, were almost entirely excluded from this world except in rare convent settings where nuns taught noble daughters how to read the Psalms and so. But let's focus on the boys, sitting cross-legged on the floor or perched on low benches, a slight board or wax tablet balanced across their knees. Their tools are primitive but functional, wooden styluses for scratching into wax, reed pens dipped in ink made from crushed oak galls, and scrap parchment that is reused again and again, with previous lessons scraped off like yesterday's dirt. The schoolmaster, often a cleric in a ruffle habit, stands at the front with a staff or rod not only to point to lessons but also to correct students. In the more physical sense of the word, corporal punishment isn't just permitted, it's expected. Discipline is seen as a spiritual good. To be struck for a grammatical mistake is to be reminded the precision. And language reflects precision in the soul. And language is everything here. The curriculum is not broad or creative. It is rigid, narrow, and astonishingly repetitive. The students memorize conjugations, declensions, and vocabulary lists, all in Latin. They chant them aloud in rhythmic unison, the schoolroom echoing with incantations of amo, amus, ament. This is not Latin as spoken by the Romans as ecclesiastical. Latin, filtered through centuries of mispronunciation and stylized for the needs of the church. Occasionally, they recite prayers or psalms. Occasionally, they copy outlines of classical authors Boethius, Virgil, or Cicero, though always through the lens of Christian morality. The point is not to understand the world through literature. It's to become part of an intellectual lineage, to think like a churchman, to prepare oneself for a life of doctrine and obligation. And yet, even here in this severe and chilly room, there is a glimmer of something familiar. The students whisper to one another when the master's back is turned. They carve their initials into the wood. They pass along rhymes to help them remember conjugations or to insult each other's pronunciation. In some cathedral schools, clever students develop elaborate mnemonic devices or even miniature plays to help internalize. Their texts sprout a drama born out of MEMO or IZATIO, and the days are long. Students arrive at dawn, sometimes even before first light in the winter, and leave at sunset. Breaks are minimal. Food might consist of bread and weak ale, if the school provides it at all, or whatever the boys bring from home and a cloth sack. The focus is on repetition, not creativity. The idea is not to express thought, but to internalize patterns. The phrase liber scholastic as the scholarly book refers not to a text full of ideas, but to a well-beaten volume used for drills. And these schools, austere though they are, begin to multiply across medieval Europe. As the church grows and as urban centers stabilize, education becomes a more visible, if still narrow, pursuit. Towns establish grammar schools funded by wealthy patrons or guilds, hoping to create literate bureaucrats or clerics who can help manage civic and church affairs. These schools are slightly less religious, but only slightly. The curriculum remains Latin-centric, and the punishments remain just as sharp. By the 12th century, a subtle shift begins. Cathedral schools, particularly those in places like Paris, Chartres, and Bologna, start to attract larger numbers of students and teachers. These are not just boys training for the cloth. Some are older. Some already have minor positions in the church. Others are young noblemen seeking education before a career at court or in administration. The cathedral school becomes a hub of inquiry and eventually the seabed for the first universities. But we're not quite there yet. In most medieval schools, Reading is taught before writing. A student might be able to recite passages from the Psalms long before he learns to form letters with ink. Writing is slow, difficult, and expensive. Mistakes on parchment are costly. So boys are drilled in letter shapes with styluses first, tracing letters into wax tablets until the strokes become muscle memory. Teachers vary widely in competence. Some are inspiring, literate men who genuinely love knowledge and want to share. Others are half-trained clerics who accepted a teaching position for the steady income. Instruction depends heavily on rote memory and the use of established texts, some of which are copies of copies riddled with marginal notes and errors. There is very little sense of age-based grade levels. A boy of 9 might study next to a boy of 15. Advancement depends on mastery, not birthdays. Some students leave after a few years, able to read and recite, but not truly write. Others stay for a decade or more, slowly accumulating the grammatical and rhetorical skills needed to move into higher education if they can afford it. What they don't learn is telling. There is no arithmetic in most early medieval schools, no science, no geography, no history, except as told through sacred texts. The world is seen as a reflection of divine order, and to understand grammar is to understand the structure of God's universe. Mathematics is limited to the monastic scriptoria, where calendar calculation is a necessity, or to Arab and Jewish scholars working in Spain and North Africa still. Small cracks begin to appear in this uniform view. By the 11th century, some schools begin incorporating the trivium grammar, logic, and rhetoric as a formal structure for education. This system encourages students not only to memorize but to reason, to argue, to explain. In doing so, it lays the groundwork for more expansive learning and eventually the university tradition. But again, that's a future still forming. For now, your world as a medieval student is mostly one of repetition, memorization, and deference. You stand when the teacher enters. You speak only when called upon. You kneel, sometimes literally, to beg forgiveness for errors. You sing hymns. You memorize rules. You chant grammar until it becomes your inner voice. At night, if you're lucky enough to be literate and have access to texts, you might read by candlelight, your eyes straining, the letters dancing, the air tinged with the smoke of cheap tallow. If you're very lucky, the book you're reading is yours to keep, though it more likely belongs to the school, chained to a lectern or locked in a cabinet. Parchment is valuable, knowledge is property. And still, in these humble rooms, something is stirring. Students begin to question, not rebelliously yet but curiously. They debate fine points of grammar. They try to reconcile logic with theology. They ask why certain texts contradict others, or why Greek authors say things that church fathers do not. In their own quiet, boring way, they begin to think. Perhaps the most medieval thing about these schools is not the paddles or the prayers, but the patience. Change comes slowly. Knowledge is built syllable by syllable, inkstroke by inkstroke, over generations. The student of today might not know much more than the student of yesterday, but he passes along the flame, preserved through memorized verse and imperfect copies. And what, you might wonder, was the point of all this rigidity? What did these boys carry with them when they finally left the schoolroom? The answer isn't always obvious. Some became clerks, some became monks, some became scholars. Others returned to work their father's fields, carrying only fragments of Latin with them. But all of them participated in a long, deliberate effort to pass knowledge down, not explosively, but carefully, one line of text at a time. They lit a candle where they could. The flame wasn't bright, but it never went out. And yet, was the education they received truly knowledge or just a memory of it? You wake up earlier now, not because of duty or prayer, but because your schoolmaster expects you to be there before the bells. The village still sleeps under a layer of dew, and the sun barely breaks the horizon. But you're already walking to the schoolhouse, half awake, clutching your cloak tighter to fight the chill. This is what routine looks like in the later medieval grammar school systems that evolved out of the cathedral models but aimed at a wider audience, thanks in part to growing towns and more complex civic administration. It's no longer only about educating future priests. Now there's a demand for educated men clerks, scribes, merchants, administrators, people who can read contracts, draft documents, keep accounts, and correspond in proper Latin. Education becomes useful in a broader sense. And so, grammar schools begin to spread across towns in England, France, Italy, and the Low Countries, offering instruction not just to sons of the nobility, but also to children of merchants, officials, and even skilled tradesmen, though still overwhelmingly male. The doors creak open just enough to suggest a future of broader access, albeit slowly and unevenly. By the 13th century, many grammar schools operate independently of monasteries, funded by civic bodies or wealthy patrons who see literacy as a form of power. Guilds and merchant associations support schools to train their members' sons. In England, schools sprout in market towns like Norwich, York, and Exeter. In Italy, cities like Florence and Siena invest in public instruction. Sometimes the schools are tied to churches, other times to the local mayor's office. The variety increases, but the structure remains traditional. Latin still dominates. The word grammar doesn't refer to punctuation or style, it refers to the entirety of Latin language education, reading, writing, syntax, vocabulary, recitation, and translation. Students still memorize passages and chant them aloud, often in unison. The use of rhythm and rhyme is not for fun, as a memory device in an oral society. The texts are slowly changing. In addition to biblical material and patristic writings, some schools begin to use popular handbooks, texts like Donatus, Cato, and the Distichs of Cato, a Roman collection of moral maxims written in elegant couplets. These simple texts are prized for their memorability and their saved values. Don't gossip, be generous, fear the gods, work hard. They are, in a way, self-help books for the medieval student, recited like proverbs. Alongside grammar comes logic and eventually rhetoric, the three pillars of the trivium. Grammar teaches how to speak and write well. Logic teaches how to think clearly, and rhetoric teaches how to persuade. In time, the most ambitious students will also study the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, but these are considered advanced topics, often reserved for the university. Still, the grammar school is where it begins, and it isn't necessarily easier now than before. In fact, it may be more demanding. As competition between students grows and expectations increase, schoolmasters become more exacting. Corporal punishment remains common. School rules are recorded in official documents, detailing how boys are to enter the classroom, how they should sit when they may speak, and how infractions will be punished. One popular Latin poem from the 13th century offers advice to schoolboys, warning them to avoid idleness, to respect their teacher, and to memorize diligently. It ends with a kind of grim cheer. Take your beatings like a man. But within these rules, new freedoms emerge. Some grammar schools begin offering what we might recognize as levels. A beginner might learn the Latin alphabet and simple conjugations. The intermediate level moves on to vocabulary and structured sentences. Advanced students study full text, Cicero, Ovid, even Aristotle, as translations become more available. Fluency in Latin is expected not only in reading, but in speaking, and students practice by composing letters and short essays. One striking feature of the later medieval classroom is disputation, an early form of academic debate. Even young students are encouraged to argue cases or interpretations of texts, especially biblical ones. They must cite sources, define terms, and follow strict rules of logic. It's more than parroting now. It's the faint beginning of critical thinking. The classroom materials remain modest. Wax tablets are still used for note-taking. Ink and parchment are costly, and mistakes cannot be easily corrected. Chalk may be used, but mostly for the schoolmaster's benefit. Some schools now maintain small libraries locked, chained, and carefully inventoried. These are symbols of prestige, not open resources. A student might get access to a book for copying, but never for private reading. Occasionally, a traveling teacher or scholar visits, stirring up excitement. These men, sometimes eccentric, sometimes brilliant, pass from town to town offering lectures in exchange for patronage. Some are seen as threats, others are warmly welcomed. They bring new ideas, fragments of Aristotle, stories from the Islamic world, insights into medicine or astronomy. Students and teachers gather eagerly. Even if they don't fully understand the material, anything new feels important. And gradually, the idea of higher learning crystallizes into something larger than a single classroom. In places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, collections of scholars, students, and texts begin to organize themselves more formally. What was once a group of teachers in a cathedral school becomes a loose guild of learners. University scholarly formed to protect students' rights, regulate instruction, and establish authority over degrees and examinations. Bologna specializes in law. Paris focuses on theology and the arts. Oxford, emerging slightly later, models itself after Paris. These universities are not buildings. At first they are communities. Students live in rented rooms. Lectures are given in borrowed halls. Degrees are earned after years of oral examinations, memorized texts, and public disputations. These institutions remain tied to the church but are not wholly dependent on it. They issue their own charters, sometimes even challenging ecclesiastical control. The Pope may bless their formation, but he cannot wholly tame them as they gain prestige. They attract scholars from across Europe. A boy who begins his studies at a grammar school in Cologne might eventually travel to Paris, then Bologna, then back again, seeking better instruction or simply a change in environment. It's worth noting that students in these early universities are not all children. Some are in their teens, yes, but many are in their 20s or older. Some are already ordained. Some are sponsored by patrons. Some, astonishingly, are self-funded, traveling hundreds of miles on foot, trading menial labor for room and board, driven by a hunger to learn. And what do they learn? The liberal arts first, the trivium and quadrivium, taught in sequence. Then, for those who continue, the higher faculties: law, medicine, and theology. Each is a discipline with its own texts, methods, and challenges. The texts are copied by hand. Lessons are read aloud by the magister, then discussed or disputed. There are no multiple choice exams, no essays. Mastery is shown through endurance, through one's ability to recite, to argue, to persist. Still, the grammar school remains the gateway. Every university student began there, and grammar schools, for all their harshness, offered a vision of a broader world. To learn Latin was to gain access to the intellectual history of the West. To parse Cicero was to speak the language of diplomacy and law. To argue in structured Latin was to join a conversation that stretched back to Augustine and forward into unknown futures. And though girls were largely excluded, exceptions slowly emerge. Some convents, particularly in Germany and northern Italy, offer instruction to girls from noble or merchant families. They learn to read, write, and sometimes even translate texts. Nuns become chroniclers, scribes, and composers of religious poetry. The walls are high and access is narrow, but the mind reaches beyond. One of the more curious developments in grammar school life is the emergence of student culture. Even in these rigid environments, boys form communities. They write mock Latin plays, they compose songs, they invent word games and riddles. Some of these entertainments survive in manuscripts, snippets of schoolboy humor, body jokes in Latin, playful critiques of their teachers. Student misbehavior becomes a recognizable genre. Chronicles record outbreaks of fighting between student factions in Paris and Bologna. At Oxford, entire villages complain about students stealing food, starting fires, or getting drunk. The church worries about student morality. Town authorities dread the violence. In time, rules are passed, dormitories established, and faculty appointed to manage discipline. But underneath the growing regulation, something remarkable happens. Learning begins to expand beyond theology, slowly, hesitantly. Secular subjects gain ground. Astronomy, once useful only for calculating Easter, becomes a subject of fascination. Medicine, inherited from Arab scholars and ancient texts, is taught with increasing sophistication. Law becomes central to governance. Natural philosophy begins to poke at the fabric of the physical world. And grammar, humble, tedious. Foundational grammar remains at the core. Every text must be parsed, every sentence diagrammed. Every student must master the syntax of Latin. Before moving on, it is the great filter, the test of seriousness. By the late 14th century, grammar schools are seen not just as preparation for holy orders, but as preparation for life. Kings sponsor schools. Merchant cities invest in education to produce literate officials. Books become marginally cheaper, though still not abundant. Manuscript culture thrives. Illuminators and copyists work long hours to produce textbooks, some adorned with elaborate borders and doodles from bored scribes. Some schools adopt timetables, morning prayers, grammar drills, midday meals, afternoon rhetoric, evening dismissal. Some offer dormitories. Some expand the curriculum to include vernacular writing, especially in England and Italy, where merchants want clerks who can write contracts in English or Italian, not just Latin. Still, the discipline remains harsh. Students are whipped for disobedience. Mockery of teachers is punishable. Speaking anything but Latin during lessons is frowned upon. But there are also prizes. Some schools offer annual poetry contests. Some allow students to perform Latin dramas for feast days. A few allow students to copy their own books to keep prized possessions carried for a lifetime. The world is changing, but in the grammar schools of the 14th and 15th centuries, education is still something you earn through repetition, suffering, and faith. And you might wonder, as schools became more complex and universities more powerful, did students truly gain more freedom of thought or simply more rules to memorize? You've made it through the long mornings of rote recitation and the cold benches of the schoolhouse. Your Latin is no longer halting, but smooth, precise, even elegant when the mood strikes. You've written enough conjugations to fill a dozen wax tablets. You've chanted the distichs of Cairo until they echo in your dreams. And now, with your grammar school, years behind you, the world of the university still new, still strange, and still deeply cloaked in tradition opens its heavy gates. The year is somewhere in the 13th or 14th century. You are in Paris, or Bologna, or perhaps you've made your way to Oxford or Prague. There's no grand entrance, no gleaming building that announces university in large, proud letters. The university isn't a place yet. It's a loose confederation of minds, a shared agreement that knowledge is worth organizing, guarding, and transmitting. What exists is a structure. You enroll, though enrollment often just means appearing before rector or scholar, signing your name, and perhaps swearing an oath. You pay fees. You rent a room in the city, maybe above a cobbler's shop or beside a tavern. Your classmates come from distant regions: Spain, Flanders, the Holy Roman Empire, even from the eastern reaches of Christendom. They arrive clutching coins, credentials, and family letters. Most are male. Many are adolescents, and some are fully grown men, ordained or nearly so, already attached to a monastery or bishop's court. Their clothing varies, but their goals align: to learn, to argue, to master the texts. The curriculum is slow, deliberate, and steeped in repetition. You start with the trivium again, this time in greater depth: grammar, logic, rhetoric, not just how to write and speak, but how to build an argument and persuade. Logic becomes especially prized. The works of Aristotle, some newly translated from Arabic sources, become core texts, setting the stage for scholasticism. that unique medieval mode of learning which seeks to reconcile faith with reason. A typical day starts early. You wake in your cold, damp lodging and make your way to a lecture hall, sometimes just a borrowed room in a church, or monastery, or a chamber in a civic building. There, your magister reads aloud from a text Boethius, Cicero, Augustine, or Aristotle, and then offers commentary. This is called the lectio, and it might last 2 hours. There's little room for questions. The professor speaks, the students listen. Writing materials are scarce, so you listen carefully and memorize. But in the afternoons, the tone changes. It's time for disputatio, public debate. This is where university life becomes something sharper, more theatrical. A master poses a question, often theological, legal, or logical in nature, and students respond with arguments for or against, citing approved authorities. One student might support the immortality of the soul using Thomas Aquinas. Another might respond using Averroes. The debate is structured, formal, and intense. Errors are corrected on the spot. Humor is rare, though some students try. Reputation matters here. Your logic must be airtight, your Latin flawless. Degrees are earned not by passing tests, but by enduring these trials. First the baccalaureate, then the coveted magisterium. You must demonstrate not only memory, but clarity, originality within bounds, and above all, adherence to intellectual tradition. Deviate too far, and you risk censure. Yet within these parameters, a certain freedom grows. And with the rise of the university comes a new kind of medieval professional, the lifelong scholar. Some students never leave. They become tutors, then lecturers, eventually earning a stipend or appointment. They write commentaries on existing texts or glosses, small, handwritten notes in the margins of manuscripts, helping to explain difficult passages. Some become philosophers or theologians of note. Others are simply content to teach, year after year, training the next wave of thinkers. Though women are largely excluded, a few figures rise in convents or through private tutoring. Hildegard of Bingen, though outside the university system, becomes an intellectual force. In Italy, Christine de Pizan writes with the depth of a university-trained mind, even if she never sat for a formal disputation. The physical structure of universities begins to evolve. In Paris, the left bank becomes a student district. At Oxford, colleges form small, residential clusters funded by noble patrons or the church. Balliol, Merton, and Exeter are among the earliest. These colleges provide food, housing, books, and moral oversight, but also camaraderie and competition. Books remain precious. Before the printing press, texts are copied painstakingly by scribes. A single volume might cost a month's wages. Some students rent books by the chapter. Chain libraries, where books are literally attached to shelves by metal chains, appear to prevent theft. Subjects begin to multiply. After mastering the liberal arts, students may enter higher faculties. Law, especially Roman law, rediscovered in Bologna. Medicine, with texts drawn from Galen and Avicenna. And theology, the crown jewel, reserved for the most devout and brilliant. Each faculty has its rituals, examinations, and expectations still. The majority of students won't become philosophers. Many enter the church. Some go on to work for courts, write for noble households, or administer towns and estates. A few join royal chanceries, becoming the pen-wielding minds behind monarchs. Their education equips them with tools of clarity and precision. They are the thinkers of their generation, trained not in innovation necessarily, but in control of language and logic. Universities are not immune to politics. Paris is occasionally shut down by papal decree or local disputes. Students riot, often. Fights break out between townspeople and scholars over debts, theft, or insults. In 1355, to Oxford students kill a tavern keeper after being served bad wine. The town retaliates by hanging to students. The university responds with a strike. Eventually, King Edward III rules in favor of the scholars, granting them special legal protection, setting a precedent for academic autonomy. Over time, universities grow bolder. They issue their own degrees, elect their own rectors, and publish statutes. They regulate who can teach, what can be taught, and how learning is preserved. They become self-aware institutions, guardians of knowledge, but also gatekeepers of status. Even the lectures evolve. By the 15th century, you might find professors experimenting with lecture formats, breaking readings into shorter segments, offering written summaries, or even encouraging students to copy diagrams. In medicine, anatomy is taught through dissection. Astronomy moves beyond theory, aided by instruments like the astrolabe and armillary sphere. Some teachers dabble in alchemy, trying to connect it to Christian doctrine. Others study logic so obsessively they fall into abstraction, creating jokes about whether angels occupy physical space. And still, it all circles back to grammar. Grammar school was the seed. Without it, none of this would exist. Grammar built the Latin fluency needed to interpret Aristotle, the clarity needed to debate theology, and the written discipline needed to copy manuscripts accurately. The trivium laid the mental groundwork. Grammar schools were never just about vocabulary, they were about shaping the mind. In the end, the quiet birth of the university is a triumph of persistence, not of revolution, but of repetition, not of fiery change, but of slow, tedious, vital development, the kind that only becomes clear in hindsight. What began in cold cloisters with boys chanting Latin verses has grown into a system that stretches across Europe, anchoring cities, standardizing education, and offering generations a new path. Not everyone took that path. Most people never saw the inside of a grammar school, let alone a university. The farmer, the blacksmith, the brewer's apprentice, they had other kinds of knowledge, equally vital. But for those who could access it, the medieval university offered something enduring, a way to think systematically, to argue respectfully, to understand deeply. By the late 15th century, as the printing press begins to change everything, education prepares to enter a new phase. Books become more accessible, literacy rises. Universities will soon contend with Reformation and Revolution, with science and secularism. But they are ready. They have centuries of grammar, logic, and disputation behind them. And as you walk across the stone courtyard, clutching your thin cloak against the morning wind, you might ask yourself, was this elaborate structure, the grammar school, the trivium, the disputations, the degrees really built to educate the mind, or to preserve the order of the world?